The wine glass tips. Red spread slow across a borrowed wedding dress unhurried, as if ruining a person were something you had all day to do. Laughter breaks across the chapel. Somewhere near the aisle a whisper orphan. The groom steps back before the binding ribbon can touch his wrist. Frost climbs the windows like lace. Beyond the glass, snow runs white to the edge of the northern woods. Mothers tell their children never to walk past after dark. A pinch of black salt scatters at the bride's feet. For unlucky brides, the laughter gets louder. Then the doors open. No thunder. Only winter breathing up the aisle and the small cold sound of old iron shifting on someone's wrist. The room goes silent all at once. The man in the doorway says nothing. He doesn't have a voice to say it with. He only lifts a small wooden board, 7 words written in dark ink. 3 years before the wedding no one wanted to attend. Ren Calder learned exactly how small a person could be made to feel and still keep breathing. It happened in the Halden still room, a cramped back chamber, smelling of dried lavender and crushed root, where she spent most of her waking hours sorting herbs into jars by candlelight long after the rest of the household had gone to bed. Nobody had ever formally assigned her the work. It had simply accumulated around her the way debris accumulates around anything left standing still long enough, until one day she looked up and realized the entire household's medicine cabinet ran through her hands and nobody else's, and nobody had thought to thank her for it, and nobody ever would. She learned the names of 100 plants that way. Which ones healed a fever and which ones in the wrong dose could stop a heart instead. Which roots eased a cough and which ground too fine could burn a throat raw. She learned it because the alternative was making a mistake that hurt someone, and she had decided, very young, that she would rather carry the weight of careful knowledge than the weight of having caused harm through carelessness. Nobody in the Halden house ever called it a skill. They called it chores. They called it the girl's job, the way you might call scrubbing floors a job. Something beneath notice. Something that only became visible the moment it wasn't done. But Ren had noticed something else quietly, over those years, tucked away where nobody thought to look. That knowing exactly how much of something could heal, and exactly how much could kill, gave a person a particular kind of power, small and unglamorous, easy to overlook, but real. She never used it against anyone. That was never the point was simpler than that. The point was that for the first time in a life spent being handed decisions made by other people, she had found one small corner of the world where her judgment mattered, where her hands did something nobody else in that house knew how to do, where being careful and being right actually meant something. It was the only thing, in 18 years under that roof, that had ever felt entirely her own. Frost on the windows of Silver Pine Chapel that morning. Frost like lace. Like something delicate trying to hide something ugly underneath. Ren Calder stood at the altar with a bouquet of winter daisies clutched so tight the stems left green marks on her palms. 23 years old, no parents, no dowry. No name that opened doors, only one that closed them quietly. The way doors close when nobody wants to be blamed for slamming them. Red wine dripped down the front of her borrowed dress. Slow. Deliberate. Like it had all day. Because Delphine Halden had wanted it that way. The chapel was full of silk and gold pins and mouths curved into smiles that had never once, not once, learned what mercy tasted like. Ren held the daisies with both hands. Because if she let go, if she let her fingers open even a little, they would see her shaking, and she would rather die than let them see that. She would not let them see that. To the Halden family she had always been the thing left on the porch during a snowstorm. Useful for scrubbing floors. Convenient for blame. Forgettable enough to hand off the moment a debt came due. Garrett Sorrell adjusted the silver cuff at his wrist and looked at her like she was a stain someone had tracked in on their boot. Handsome. In the way a blade is handsome. All shine, no warmth. Behind the first pew, Delphine smiled behind a gloved hand, empty wine glass still tilting between 2 fingers. Oops, just loud enough, just cruel enough. Just for the people close to the aisle to hear it and laugh. And they did laugh, laughter moving through the chapel like a draft under a door. Ren lowered her eyes. The wine sticky against her collarbone. But the humiliation burned worse than the cold wine ever could. Elder Corwin cleared his throat. Tried to save what was left of the ceremony. Garrett stepped back before the binding ribbon could touch his wrist. The whole chapel went still. I will not bind myself, he said, calm, polished, final, to an orphan with servant blood. The words landed one at a time like stones dropped into still water. Orphan servant. Blood, someone snickered behind her. Someone else murmured that the moon goddess must have a cruel sense of humor tonight. Delphine leaned toward her mother. At least the dress was already ruined. Ren wanted the floor to open, wanted the old wood beneath her feet to simply take her, swallow her, be done with the whole embarrassing performance of her life. Instead she lifted her chin because pride was the last thing left that they hadn't managed to take from her yet. Elder Corwin looked pained. Then the bride is unclean. Soft, careful. Like the words themselves might bite him. By pack law the debt remains with the Halden household unless another accepts the bond. And that was when the doors opened. Not loud, not dramatic. Just an old creak of wood and a slow wash of winter air moving up the aisle like something exhaling after holding its breath too long. Every head turned. A man in the doorway, tall. A dark coat, weathered at the shoulders like it had survived more winters than he had years. One wrist circled by an old iron shackle, catching the candlelight and throwing it back thin and cold. A scar along his jaw, dark hair falling near his collar. No family crest, no escort, no flowers. Only silence. Someone near the back whispered his name like it was something you weren't to say indoors. Kellen Ashgrove, the silent outcast. The cursed man from the edge of the northern woods. Srin had heard the stories. No voice, no pack, no table where he was welcome. Mothers told their children not to wander near his cabin after dark, not because he'd ever hurt anyone, but because nobody could say for certain that he wouldn't, and uncertainty is its own kind of monster. Garrett laughed first. Then the others followed, relieved almost to have a new target for their cruelty. Kellen didn't look at them. His gray eyes found Ren through the crowd. Steady, unreadable. Then he lifted a small wooden board in one gloved hand. 7 words written in dark, careful ink. I will take the bride no one wants. The laughter exploded around him. Ugly and immediate. But Ren stopped breathing. Because for the first time all day, all year maybe, all her life, someone had looked at her without shame stapled to the back of it. The words hung in the air a long time after he lowered the board. I will take the bride no one wants. For one impossible heartbeat, Ren heard nothing at all. Not the whispers. Not the laughter, sharp and delighted at Garrett's expense now, instead of hers. Not the scrape of his boots as he stepped aside like the whole ceremony had become a private joke written just for his entertainment. She only heard her own breath. Thin, careful, and the slow drip of wine hitting the floor beneath her borrowed dress. Elder Corwin stared at Kellen like the man had just offered to walk into a storm and call it shelter. Mr. Ashgrove strained. This is a binding right. Not an act of pity. Kellen didn't answer. Of course he didn't. He only moved down the aisle, measured steps. The old shackle at his wrists making a small sound beneath the murmur of the crowd, a sound like a key that didn't fit any lock anyone in that room had ever seen. Ren noticed how people leaned away as he passed. Alphas who'd been laughing at her moments ago suddenly found reasons to study their shoes. Betas shrank back into the pews like the wood itself might offer protection. Even Delphine's smile faltered. She caught it, forced it back into place. But it had faltered. Garrett folded his arms, perfect, loud enough for the whole room. A voiceless man for a worthless bride. The moon goddess is feeling poetic today. Laughter again. Sharper this time. Hungrier. But Kellen didn't look embarrassed. He stopped several feet from her. Close enough that she could see the pale scar along his jaw. The strange, terrible calm in his eyes. No pleading in that calm. No hunger. No ownership. Just a question. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper soft at the creases from being opened and closed too many times to count, handed it to her with careful fingers. The kind of careful that comes from a man who has learned, the hard way, what happens when you take up too much space. She hesitated. The chapel watched, hungry for more. The paper trembled slightly in her hand when she finally took it and tried inside. Dark. Steady. Almost formal. You may walk away. Debt no shame. I will leave if you ask me to. She rests. Then it, because she didn't trust it the first time. All her life, choices had belonged to other people.
Where she slept.
How much food was left once everyone else had eaten their fill? Whether she was useful enough, quiet enough, small enough, to be worth keeping around one more season. And now this man, this feared stranger with a broken voice and iron at his wrist, was handing her the one thing nobody in that chapel had ever offered. Freedom. Delphine's laugh came out, delicate as glass. Don't be ridiculous, Ren. He probably wants a maid. Not a wife. Garrett leaned in, smile bright and cruel. Take the offer, it's the best an orphan can hope for. Ren's fingers tightened around the paper. She looked at Kellen. He hadn't moved, still waiting. Not taking, not demand, not rescuing her like she was something broken that needed fixing, simply waiting, something inside her. Small, bruised, not dead yet, lifted its head. She turned to Elder Corwin, her voice trembled. But it did not break. Continue the rite. A hush dropped over the chapel like a curtain. Garrett's smile disappeared. Delphine blinked, slow like Wren had spoken a language she'd never learned. Elder Corwin swallowed. Child, are you certain? Wren looked once more at Kellen Ashgrove. At the man everyone feared and nobody understood. Yes, soft, certain. I will marry him. And for the first time, something changed in his expression. Only a flicker. But it was there, bright and stunned. As if her answer had reached some place inside him that no voice, his or anyone else's, had ever managed to touch. Elder Corwin looked from Wren to Kellen, then to the silent watching chapel, like he was hoping someone kinder than him might step forward and stop what was already in motion. No one did. The polished guests only watched. Bright eyes, hungry eyes, eager to see how low an orphan girl and a cursed outcast could fall together. The binding ribbon lay across the altar. White silk threaded with silver, meant for wrists warmed by blessing candles and buried in flowers, but instead, someone near the front tossed a pinch of black salt at Wren's feet. Old superstition. For unlucky brides. The grains scattered across the wood like tiny dark stars that had fallen the wrong direction. Delphine soft and satisfied. For protection. We'd hate for her misfortune to follow the rest of us home. Wren kept her eyes forward, but shame pressed against her ribs so hard she could barely draw breath around it. Kellen noticed. He noticed everything. Without a word he stepped closer, placed one boot gently over the scattered salt, hid it from the room like it had never been thrown at all. Small gesture. Nobody else in that chapel understood it. Wren did. He had covered the insult before it could touch her twice. Elder Corwin lifted the ribbon. Stiff fingers. Place your right hands upon the altar. Wren went first, palm trembling against cold stone. Kellen set his hand beside hers. Careful not to crowd her. Careful not to claim more room than she had offered. The old iron shaft brushed the altar. A quiet sound. Up close she could see faint marks beneath the metal, not fresh. The pale memory of something endured too long to still be called an injury. By pack law, Elder Corwin said, voice low with discomfort, this bond is witnessed, not celebrated. Do you both accept the burden of this union? Garrett, from the side. Another laugh. Wren felt Kellen's fingers shift beside hers. Not touching, not gripping, just present. Steady as a wall at her back that she hadn't asked for and somehow needed anyway. Corwin looked to Kellen first. Kellen raised his free hand, one firm nod, then to Wren. The whole chapel seemed to lean toward her answer, waiting for doubt. Waiting for regret to show up late the way it always had before. She thought of the porch where she'd been left as a baby. The kitchen where she ate standing up because no chair had ever been saved for her. Years of being grateful for scraps of kindness that were never, if you looked closely enough, actually kind. Then she thought of the paper folded in her palm. You may walk away, no debt, no shame. She lifted her chin. I accept. Every candle on the altar flared silver. Gasps tore through the chapel. The ribbon warmed against her skin. Not burning. Not hurting. Glowing soft, like moonlight had somehow gotten inside the thread. Kellen went still, completely still. His gray eyes widened. And for the first time the silent outcast looked almost afraid. Not of her. Of what had just woken up somewhere beyond the chapel walls. Far out in the winter woods a wolf howled. Slow. Powerful. Every wolf in the room lowered its gaze without knowing why it had. Wren didn't look back when she left Sylvan Chapel. If she had, she might have seen Delphine standing frozen beside the aisle, smile gone the color of the snow outside. Or Garrett staring at the silver candles, like they'd personally insulted his family name. But she kept her eyes on the doors. And the white world beyond them. Because one backward glance might have pulled her straight back into the shame. And she had already survived enough of that for one lifetime, let alone one morning. Kellen walked beside her, not touching to. The binding ribbon folded now in Elder Corwin's shaking hands, proof the marriage had been sealed whether the pack liked it or not. Outside, winter swept across the chapel steps, lifted loose strands of her hair. The borrowed dress clung damp where the wine had spilled, and cold slid through the thin fabric almost instantly. Before she could hide the shiver, Kellen removed his coat. Held it out. She hesitated. Too large, worn at the cuffs. Warmer than anything she'd ever owned in her life. He didn't push it around her shoulders like a claim staked in the ground. He waited until she chose to take it herself. That small patience nearly broke her. She pulled the coat close, breathed in pine smoke and winter rain and something underneath it she couldn't name. Wild, old, familiar in a way that made no sense at all. At the bottom of the steps, an old, black carriage. Wait, one gray horse? No driver, you came alone? She asked soft. Kellen looked at her. A single nod. Of course he had. Men like him weren't escorted anywhere. As he helped her into the kitchen, the chapel bell rang once behind them. Not a celebration. Elder Corwin. Probably. Pulling the rope by accident, hands still shaking from everything he'd just witnessed. The lonely sound followed them down the narrow road, into the northern woods. For the first mile Wren sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening to wheels crushing snow and gravel beneath them. She wanted to ask a dozen questions. Where are we going? Why did you off? What happened to your voice? Why did the candles turn to silver the second I said yes? But Kellen held the reins in silence, profile calm beneath the gray afternoon light. And Wren found herself strangely afraid to disturb whatever peace had settled between them. After a while he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small notebook, pencil tucked into the spine. On the first page, written before that morning, before he'd ever walked through those chapel doors, "You are safe with me." Wren stared at the sentence until it blurred. Nobody had ever promised her safety without asking for something in return. Behind them far down the road, hooves. Kellen heard them before she did. Shoulders shifting. Not fear. Attention, 3 riders between the bare trees moving fast enough to send snow flying off the road. Wren recognized the silver saddle pins, Garrett's men. Her stomach tightened. They followed us. Kellen slowed the carriage, handed her the notebook. Stay inside. He stepped down into the snow. Wren clutched the coat around herself, watched through the small window. Couldn't hear the words. Only saw laughing mouths, careless gestures, the particular swagger of men who'd never once had to be afraid of anything in their lives. Kellen stood still, one shackled wrist at his side, the other resting light against the horse's neck. The gray horse didn't start. The woods did. Every branch went quiet, every bird stopped moving. A minute passed, then another. The riders' laughter faded, thinned, disappeared entirely. One by one their horses backed away, ears flat, refusing to come any closer no matter how hard the reins were pulled. The men tugged and swore and got nothing for it. Confused first, then something closer to frightened. At last they turned, rode back towards Silverpine without a single hand raised against him. Kellen returned to the carriage like nothing at all had happened. When Wren looked at him, he wrote 2 words in the notebook. Horses disagree. Despite everything, despite the wind still drying stiff on her dress and the salt still somewhere back there scattered under a boot print, she almost smiled. But as the carriage rolled deeper into the trees, she saw something through the pines. A massive white wolf, standing on a ridge half a mile off, watching Kellen with its head bowed low, like it already knew something she didn't. Kellen's cabin sat where the northern woods grew thick enough to swallow sound whole. Smaller than she'd expected. Dark timber and gray stone. Smoke curling from a chimney no one should have been near enough to tend, not for a man supposedly living alone at the edge of nowhere. Snow gathered soft along the roofline. Beyond the porch pines rose like silent witnesses standing guard over something. From outside it looked like the lonely home of a man the world had simply forgotten to keep track of. Inside it felt like a secret holding its breath. Wren stepped across the threshold, his coat still around her shoulders, the ruined dress, brushing wooden floorboards. Warmth wrapped around her at once, a fire already burning in the hearth low and steady. A kettle resting near the coals. 2 cups waiting on the table set to Kellen. He only closed the door behind them, set the small notebook by the entry, like the whole scene had arranged itself without needing his hands at all. Did someone know we were coming? He paused. Wrote, some houses remember their owners. It should have sounded impossible. Standing there with candlelight trembling over shelves of old books and polished brass instruments, she almost believed it anyway. The cabin was too tidy for an outcast, too careful for a poor man. No family portraits, no personal clutter of an ordinary life lived in an ordinary way. Everything had purpose. Everything looked placed to be found only by someone brave enough or desperate enough to actually look. Kellen pointed toward a small room off the hall, handed her a folded bundle, clean clothes. Rest. His handwriting steady. But his eyes lingered a beat too long on the wine stain across her dress. Something tightened in his face. Quiet regret. There and gone, thank you. Her barely above a breath. He nodded once, turned away before the gratitude could grow too heavy to carry between them. The room held a narrow bed, a wash basin, A plain blue dress. Soft, not elegant. Warm, not new. Cared for the way things are cared for by someone who understands what it means not to have very much. As she changed, she caught her reflection in a small mirror. For the first time all day, she looked less like a public embarrassment, and more like a woman who had simply survived something. She sat for a moment on the edge of the narrow bed, letting her hands finally stop shaking, letting the enormity of the day settle over her in slow waves. Because it hadn't fully landed yet, not really. Not the wine, not the salt. Not the word servant hurled across a chapel like a stone meant to draw blood. Not the strange, quiet man who had walked through those doors and offered her, of all the things in the world he might have offered, a choice. She thought of her foster mother briefly, the woman who'd raised her those first few years before illness had taken her too soon, before the Haldens had absorbed Wren into their household, less out of kindness than out of the particular calculating charity that expected repayment eventually, in scrubbed floors and sorted herbs and gratitude that never quite balanced the ledger. Her foster mother used to say that kindness given freely always finds its way home eventually, even when the road it travels looks nothing like the one you expected. Wren hadn't believed that most days. Hadn't had much reason to. But sitting there in a stranger's borrowed room, wrapped in a stranger's borrowed kindness, she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, willing to consider that her foster mother might have been onto something after all. Because if this was what a road home finally looked like, arriving sideways and unannounced in the middle of the worst day of her life, then perhaps she'd simply never recognized it before, having never once been given the chance to see what it looked like up close. She splashed cold water on her face from the wash basin, breathed slowly until her heartbeat settled back into something ordinary, and pulled on the soft blue dress with hands that had at last stopped trembling entirely. When she returned, Kellen was setting bread and hot tea on the table. He didn't sit until she did. That too unsettled her. The Haldens had always eaten first, servants waited. Orphans took what remained after everyone else had already decided what they wanted. Wren wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Let the steam touch her face. Then her gaze drifted past him. To the wall behind, half hidden beneath a dark cloth, a map of the Northern Territories, silver pins, red thread. Beside it, a locked glass case holding a black cloak embroidered with the faint outline of a crowned wolf. Her pulse slowed to something careful. She'd seen that symbol exactly once before. Stamped into the royal decrees that arrived at Silverpeen each winter. Read aloud by men who never let anyone touch the paper itself. No one noticed where she was looking. The room changed anyway. Not the light. Not the sound, the feeling. The air sharpened like something had walked in behind her. Kellen rose. Careful. Pulled the cloth back over the map. Too late. Wren was already standing on the small writing desk nearby, an unfinished letter. Ink dried halfway through a sentence. Your Majesty, the throne cannot remain empty much longer. Her fingers hovered above the page. Didn't touch it. Didn't need to. Behind her, Kellen didn't move. She turned slowly, the silent man she'd married standing in the firelight. One shackled wrist at his side, gray eyes darker now than the winter sky outside. Kellen, barely a whisper. Who are you really? He didn't answer. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It filled the cabin like deep water, pressing against the walls, the windows, the space between them. Your Majesty. The words wouldn't leave her mind. Kellen reached for the notebook. Stopped. As if even writing had suddenly become too dangerous a thing to attempt. Firelight moved over the iron at his wrist. And for the first time she noticed the faint silver symbols carved along its edge. Not decoration, a lock. His breathing changed, a sharp inhale controlled too quickly, fingers curling around the back of the chair. The wood gave a faint groan beneath his grip. Kellen. She took one step forward. He stepped back immediately, shook his head. Not anger. Warning. Then the shackle began to glow. Not bright, not beautiful, hot and pale like moonlight trapped inside metal that had never once agreed to hold it. He closed his eyes, jaw tight, shoulders rigid under a weight he refused to let her see. Her fear shifted into something else. Concern, instinct. The same quiet pull that had carried her hand toward the binding ribbon now carried her feet across the room. He lifted the notebook with visible effort. Wrote 3 words, stay away. The pencil slipped from his hand before he could write anything more. Wren stared at the words, then at him. All her life, she'd obeyed warnings meant to keep powerful people comfortable. Stay quiet, stay useful, stay small enough not to be noticed. But this was different. This was a man trying to protect her from his own suffering. No soft certain. Kellen opened his eyes, panicked. They're now carefully buried, but unmistakably real. He shook his head again, sharper. She ignored it. took a clean towel from beside the washbasin, soaked it in cool water, moved to his side. When she reached for the glowing shackle, he pulled his arm away. Not fast enough to frighten her. Never enough to frighten her. I am not made of glass. Her voice steady now, steadier than she felt. And you are not the only person in this room who has learned how to endure pain quietly. Something in his face broke. Not fully, just a crack. Enough that she saw for one unguarded second, the lonely place hiding behind it. He let her take his wrist. The metal was warm beneath the cloth. Warmer than it should have been. It didn't harm her. He watched her like she'd just done something impossible. Minutes passed, the glow began to fade. The tightness in his shoulders loosened. Degree by degree. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. Inside, the cabin seemed to breathe again. Slow and careful, like something that had been holding its breath along with him. When he could move, Kellen picked up the pencil. Fingers wrote across a clean page. Do not be kind to monsters. Ren read it, looked at him a long moment. The scar along his jaw. The iron at his wrist. The royal secrets hidden under dust and cloth. The terrible restraint of a man who could have taken anything from anyone's instead asked for nothing at all. She folded the damp towel, set it aside. Then stop acting like one. Kellen stared at her. Somewhere deep inside, gap, the cam. A sound echoed. Faint. A bell beneath ice. A thin crack appeared across one silver symbol on the shackle. Ren saw it, so did he. And for the first time since she'd met him, his lips parted like a word had almost found its way home. By morning the crack had faded to a thin silver line. But Ren couldn't stop seeing it. She moved through the cabin quietly, folding the wool dress, washing the cup, pretending ordinary tasks could make the night before feel like something ordinary too. Kellen stood near the window with the notebook in hand, watching the tree line like the forest had begun speaking to him in a language only he understood. The silence between them had changed. No longer a wall, a door, closed still. But no longer locked from both sides at once. She wanted to ask about the letter, the royal cloak, the shackle. The almost word that had trembled on his lips before dawn. Instead she asked the safer question. Will they come back? He didn't turn, wrote without looking down. They already have. She followed his gaze. Beyond the frosted glass, figures moved between the pines. Not 3 riders this time. More than a dozen, silver saddle pins. Halden family colors. At the center, wrapped in white fur that had never once known hardship, Delphine Halden stepped from the trees like she owned the snow beneath her boots. Garrett walked beside her. Polished confidence restored now that he'd brought an audience. Ren's stomach tightened, but she did not step back. Not this time. A hard knock struck the door. Kellen reached for the latch. Ren touched his sleeve. Let me. His eyes searched hers. She nodded once, steadier than she felt, and opened the door herself. Cold air rushed in. Delphine's gaze swept past her. Into the cabin, hunting for proof of poverty and shame and weakness, anything at all she could carry home and use. She found the clean hearth instead. The books. Her mouth thinned. So this is where you ran. A pause, sweet and poisonous. How charming. Like a servant playing house. Garrett's gaze slid to Kellen. Ashgrove, step aside, this doesn't concern you. Kellen remained near the hearth. The shackle hidden beneath his sleeve. Delphine lifted a folded document. The marriage is under review. Elder Corwin has no authority to bind a Halden household ward to a man without rank, property or veripsit standing. Red belongs with us until the debt is settled. Belongs. The word moved through Ren like a door slamming shut somewhere behind her ribs. For years she'd heard it in softer forms. Our girl. Our responsibility, our burden. Always dressed up as care. Always shaped underneath like chains as. I'm not going back, her voice quiet. But it. Karen smiled. You don't decide that. Garrett stepped onto the porch. Bears 2 families yesterday. Enough of the shift behind her. She lifted one hand, asking him to wait. No. Steady now. Yesterday I was embarrassed. Today I am finished. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Delphine's cheeks colored. You ungrateful little nobody. She reached for the coat still around Ren's shoulders. Ren caught the fabric first. Held it closed. The forest went silent. Not peaceful listening. Garrett laughed, though it came out thinner now. What's he going to do? Write us an angry note? Delphine's eyes swept the cabin one more time, landing finally on the small writing desk visible through the open door behind Ren, on the corner of paper just barely visible there, the one that began with 2 words neither of them had meant for anyone else to see. Her expression sharpened. What's that? She said, stepping closer. craning to see past Ren's shoulder. That paper on the desk. Ren's stomach dropped. She hadn't thought to hide it, hadn't imagined anyone would get close enough to look. Nothing that concerns you, she said, too quickly, and Delphine's smile, thin and delighted, told her instantly that quickness had been exactly the wrong choice. Concerns me a great deal, Delphine said. If the voiceless outcast my family's ward married in a fit of foolish pride happens to be writing letters, addressed like royalty. Garrett's gaze sharpened too, following hers. Let me see that. No, Ren's, and this time her voice came out steadier, harder, the particular hardness of someone realizing exactly how much was suddenly, unexpectedly, at stake. This is my home now, you don't get to walk through it uninvited and start reading whatever you please. Delphine's laugh came out brittle. Your home. Listen to her. 2 days married to a cursed hermit and already she's playing lady of the house. Kellen stepped forward then. One step, only one. The porch boards didn't creak. The wind didn't move. Even Garrett stopped smiling. Sir Kellen removed his black glove. On the back of his hand, pale winter light, catching it like it had been waiting years for exactly this moment, a mark appeared. Silver and midnight blue. A crowned wolf. Surrounded by 7 stars. Guard dropped to a knife before he seemed to understand why his body had done it. Ren stared at the mark, breath caught somewhere between fear and something close to wonder, while Kellen lifted his eyes to Garrett with the terrible calm of a man who had chosen silence for far too many years and was only now beginning to understand why. Garrett's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Behind them the wind picked up, carrying snow across the yard in slow white pieces soft as ash falling from somewhere very far away. And Ren understood, standing there in a dead man's borrowed coat with her heart hammering against her ribs, that whatever she had just married into, it was only beginning to show its face. That night, after Delphine and Garrett and the rest of the shaken procession had long since ridden back toward Silverpine, Ren sat by the fire while Kellen banked the coals for the night, both of them quiet in the particular way of 2 people who have just watched the shape of their life change and haven't yet found the words to discuss it properly. You could have told me, she said finally, before the mark appeared, before any of it. You could have simply told me who you were. Kellen set down the poker, considered the question with his usual careful weight. He reached for the notebook, though his voice, still rough and rarely used, had grown steadier over these last days than she'd yet heard it. Would you have believed me? He said if a voiceless stranger with iron at his wrist had claimed, in that chapter, to be the missing king everyone assumed was dead? Ren considered that honestly. No. I don't suppose I would have. Neither would anyone else, Kellen said. Proof matters more than claims. It's a kingdom that spent years being told a comfortable lie. I needed you to choose me for exactly what I appeared to be that day. Nothing more. If you'd chosen a crown instead of a person, I don't think either of us would trust what we'd built together now. Ren turned that over, understanding slowly, the particular integrity threaded through a decision that must have cost him considerably. Choosing silence over the easier path of simply telling her the truth and letting the truth do the persuading for him. That's either the most thoughtful thing anyone's ever done for me, she said, or the most terrifying. I haven't decided which. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Perhaps both. I've found over the years those 2 things travel together more often than people expect. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling gently against the shuttered windows, and somewhere far off in the tree line, the same low howl from that morning rose again, briefer this time, almost, a Ren thought, like a question being asked and quietly, patiently answered. What happens now, she asked. Beyond tonight. Kellen was quiet a long moment watching the last of the firelight settle into embers. Now we survive whatever Crane sends next. And we find proof strong enough that survival becomes something more permanent than simply outlasting his patience. He looked at her, steady and certain despite everything the day had cost him. And somewhere in between all of that, I intend to actually earn the choice you made today. Not just accept it. Earn it. Ren felt something loosen in her chest, some tension she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. Since the moment she'd said I accept in front of a chapel full of people certain she'd made the worst decision of her short difficult life. I think you already have, she said quietly. Whatever comes next. The days between the confrontation on the porch and the letter's arrival were, strangely, the gentlest Ren could remember living through. Not easy. Nothing about a cabin shared with a man carrying 5 years of secrets could be called easy. But gentle silence can be gentle once you stop expecting it to turn on you. She learned his rhythms first. The way he rose before dawn most mornings. Not from restlessness but from years of a body trained to distrust sleeping past first light. The way he checked the tree line out of habit every time he passed a window. A small unconscious motion, quick and practiced. The particular vigilance of a man who had spent years alone somewhere that could not always be trusted to stay safe. She learned too, that his silence, even now that the notebook had become less necessary, wasn't emptiness. It was consideration. He thought before he spoke, weighed words the way she weighed herbs, careful of exactly how much anything a person could safely be given at once. You don't have to measure every sentence, she told him one evening, watching him hesitate over something, the words visibly forming and reforming behind his eyes before he finally let them out. 5 years of silence teaches you that words matter, he said. Once you understand how much weight they can carry, it's hard to hand them out carelessly again. That's not a flaw, Ren said. Most people I've known could stand to measure their words a little more carefully. Myself included some days. He'd looked at her for a long moment after that, something warm and unguarded settling into his expression, and said nothing further, which she understood by then, was its own kind of answer. They fell into small routines neither of them had planned. She cooked, mostly, having learned in the Halden kitchen out of necessity rather than choice, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that cooking for someone who actually thanked her for it felt entirely different from cooking for people who expected it as their due. He chopped wood, mended the fence along the eastern edge of the property, fixed a hinge on the barn door that had been loose. He told her once by scrawled note, since before he'd lost his voice at all. In the evenings they sat by the fire, and sometimes he wrote, and sometimes she read from one of the many books lining his shelves, and sometimes they simply sat in a silence that had stopped, somewhere in those quiet days, feeling like something either of them needed to fill. Can I ask you something? She said, one such evening, watching firelight move across his face. He looked up, waiting. Do you regret it? Offering for me that day, before you knew anything about who I'd turn out to be, or what any of this would cost you to finish. Kellen set down the knife he'd been idly sharpening, considered the question with the same careful weight he gave most things. I've thought about that day a great deal, he said slowly. About what would have happened if I'd stayed silent in that doorways instead. If I'd let you walk out of that chapel with Garrett's cruelty as the last thing anyone ever said to you. He shook his head. No, I don't regret it. I think it might be the only decision in 5 years I've made without a single moment of doubt attached to it. Rin felt something settle warm in her chest, something she didn't yet have a name for, not fully, not with any certainty, but she recognized the shape of it well enough to know it mattered. Good, she said softly. Because I don't regret it either, whatever comes next. Neither of them knew yet, in that quiet firelit evening, exactly how much would come next, or how quickly the gentle rhythm they'd built would be tested. But for that one evening, at least, it was enough simply to sit together, unhurried, in a peace neither of them had expected to find. 3 days. 3 days since the mark had burned silver on the back of Kellen's hand and sent Garrett Sorrell's men stumbling backward off the porch, like the snow itself had teeth. 3 days since Delphine Halden had gone the color of bone and left without her document, without her guard's dignity, without a single word for once in her life. And the woods had not quiet since feasted first in the way the birds behaved. Because birds don't lie the way people do. Birds don't smile while they're planning something ugly. They just go quiet, or they don't. And that morning, standing at the cabin window with a cup of tea cooling in her hands, she realized the birds outside had gone quiet 3 days running. Which meant something was watching the cabin. Which meant it hadn't stopped watching since the day the mark appeared. She didn't say anything about it. Not yet. Because Kellen already carried enough weight, without her handing him one more thing to brace against, and because some part of her, the part that had spent 23 years learning to read a room before it turned on her, understood that he already knew. He always already knew. The letter came on the 4th morning, not by writer, not by hand. It came the way important things arrive in places like the northern woods, which is to say it simply appeared, folded on the porch step at first light, no footprints in the fresh snow leading to it or away from it, like whoever delivered it had learned to walk without weight. Kellen found it before Ren was even dressed. She heard him at the door, heard the particular stillness that came over him when something was wrong, a stillness different from his ordinary quiet, sharper somehow, the stillness of a man listening for a second heartbeat under his own. She came out in the blue wool dress, hair still loose, and found him standing in the doorway with the letter open in his hands and his face doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not fear. Recognition. What is it? He didn't answer with the notebook. He just held it out to her instead, and that alone told her something. Because he never let her read things meant only for him. He guarded his own history like a man guards a wound, quietly, constantly, without ever quite admitting it's there. The letter was written in a hand too elegant to belong to any soldier. Gold ink on cream paper, sealed with wax pressed by a ring she didn't recognize, though she noticed, the moment she saw it, that Kellen's jaw had gone tight the way it did the night the shackle glowed. She read it aloud. Because some part of her thought that saying the words out loud might make them smaller, it didn't. To his grace, long absent from the throne he was born to hold. The kingdom grieves the years lost to your affliction. The regency stands ready to relinquish its burden the moment you are prepared to reclaim what is yours. Come to the capital. Come home. Bring whoever you have chosen to stand beside you. All will be forgiven, all will be restored. Signed beneath the crest of a crowned wolf circled by 7 stars, Aldrich Crane, Regent of the Northern Crown. Wren lowered the paper slowly. Regent, she said. Testing the word. Someone's been ruling in your place. Kellen nodded once. For how long? He held up 5 fingers. She thought of the marks on his wrist beneath the shackle. Thought of the map with silver pins and red thread half hidden under cloth. Thought of the unfinished letter on his desk. Your Majesty, the throne cannot remain empty much longer. You were writing to someone, she said, slow, careful. Before I found the letter that night. You were already trying to reach someone in the capital. He nodded again. Who? He took the notebook back. Wrote 3 words, and the pencil pressed hard enough into the page that she could feel the shape of them even through the paper. Someone I trust. A writer came before they'd finished deciding anything at all. Not Crane's men this time. A single, wearing the royal blue livery of a court messenger. The crowned wolf stitched properly.
Correctly.
Across his chest in a way that made Wren's stomach tighten before she understood why. Because a correct crest was almost more alarming than a wrong one. Kellen met him at the tree line. Knife nowhere visible but close enough. Wren knew. To reach in under a second. Message for Lord Ashgrove. The rider dismounted. Breath fogging in the cold, posture stiff with the particular formality of a man who had rehearsed this exact greeting the whole ride out. By order of the regent, I'm to escort you to the capital personally, safe passage guaranteed. Wren studied him from the porch. Studied the horse too, lathered with sweat despite the cold, ridden hard and fat. Something about snagged in her mind and wouldn't let go. How long since you left the capital, she asked, stepping down into the snow before Kellen could answer for both of them. The messenger blinked, faintly startled that the question had come from her. 2 days, my lady. Rode through the night both ways. 2 days. She looked at the horse again. At the foam drying stiff along its neck, the particular exhausted slump of an animal pushed well past a reasonable tps. That's a hard ride for a message that could have waited for the next courier circuit. The regent was insistent, the man said, given the delicacy of the situation. Delicate. Wren repeated the word slowly, tasting it. Interesting choice for a man claiming he's simply relieved his king is alive. Kellen's eyes flicked to her, something sharpening behind them. The particular attention of a man who had learned, the hard way, to trust exactly this kind of instinct in her. May I ask your name, she said. Corinvale, my lady. 3rd Rider of the Capitol Guard. She held that too, turned it over. Something about the rank didn't sit right, though she couldn't have said precisely why. Not yet. Not until the shape of the wrongness finally settled into something she could name out loud. The 3rd Rider, she said slowly, would carry the capital seal on his travel papers, not just his livery. The messenger's expression flickered. Barely. A man catching himself half a second too late. My papers were lost, he said, fording the river 2 days back. I nearly lost the horse as well. How convenient, Wren said, that you kept the livery dry. Kellen's hand moved, slow and unhurried, toward the knife at his belt. The messenger's composure cracked all at once, the practiced formality dropping away like a mask that had never quite fit. He went for the blade at his own hip, but had been faster the entire conversation, closing the distance in 2 strides and pinning the man's wrist against the trunk of the nearest pine before the blade cleared its sheath. Who sent you? Kellen said low final. The man's breath came ragged, eyes darting between Kellen and Wren like he was recalculating. Too late. Exactly how badly he'd misjudged the situation. The regent, he admitted, voice tight with pain where Kellen's grip had tightened. He wanted to know if you'd survived the lodge. If the poison had worked. I was only meant to confirm it, report back. Nothing more. And if I hadn't survived, Kellen said. What then? The man didn't answer. Didn't need to. Ren felt something cold settle in her chest. The particular clarity that comes from watching a lie's true shape finally step out of the shadows it had been hiding in. He sends a fake summons, she said slowly, working it through even as she spoke it aloud. Hoping you'll walk into the capital and let his own men handle things quietly there. When that fails, when the ambush at the lodge fails too, he sends someone to check whether you're already dead from the poison, so he can decide his next move accordingly. Layers, Kellen said grimly. He always builds in layers. In case one plan fails, there's already another waiting behind it. They tied the false messenger to a support post inside the barn, left him with water and a warning that Crane's answer would come from Kellen's own mouth soon enough, and turned back toward the cabin to finish what the interruption had delayed. Because if Crane already had eyes this close, Kellen wrote later that night, by then trusting his voice again for most of it, but still reaching for the notebook when exhaustion blurred the words. Then every hour spent deciding was an hour handed straight to the enemy, which meant the plan they made next needed to be the last one they had time to make carefully. They didn't leave that day. Kellen wouldn't let her, not without reading the letter 3 more times first, holding it up to the window, like he was looking for something hidden underneath the gold ink, and on the 4th reading his whole body went still in a new way, a way that made the hair on Ren's arms rise before she understood. He set the letter on the table, tapped one finger against the wax seal. Then he wrote a single word beneath it. Wrong. Wrong how? He drew the crest again on a fresh page, the crowned wolf, the 7 stars, exactly as it appeared on the seal. Then beneath it, from memory, he drew it a second time. Studied both. They looked to her eye identical. Except the stars in the second drawing curved slightly differently around the wolf's crown. A small thing. The kind of thing only someone who had worn that crest against his own skin for years, who had seen it stamped into decrees and stitched into cloaks and carved into palace stone since before he could walk, would ever notice at all. The seal is fake, she said. He shook his head. Wrote again. Not fake. Close. Too close for a forger who's never held the real one. Which means someone in the palace made this. Ren felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though nothing had actually moved. Someone loyal to Crane. Kellen's jaw worked. He wrote one more line, and this time his hand wasn't quite steady. Or Crane himself. Testing whether I'd notice. That night Ren couldn't sleep. Because somewhere out past the tree line a man who called himself Regent had sent a letter dressed up as mercy. In Ren's experience, was rarely handed out by people who had spent 5 years comfortable on a throne that wasn't theirs. She found Kellen at the table long after the fire had burned to coals. Notebook open. Pencil moving in short, restless bursts. Not writing to her. Writing for himself. The way people write when they're trying to think their way out of a room with no door. She sat across from him. Didn't speak. Just watched the candlelight move over the scar on his jaw, the shadow under his eyes, the way his shoulders carried the weight of years like a second shackle nobody could see. Finally she asked the question she'd been circling all evening. What happened to you, really? He stopped writing. For a long moment the only sound was the fire settling, a log shifting, sending up one small burst of orange sparks that died before they reached the chimney. Then he began to write. Slower this time. I was king, 23 years old. My father dead 6 months. Crane was his oldest advisor. Trusted since before I was born. He told me the crown needed a regent until I proved myself ready. Because why wouldn't I? He'd carried me on his shoulders as a child. Ren waited. Didn't rush him. There was a ceremony binding ritual, meant to seal the crown to the bloodline, until I formally claimed it. Crane said it was tradition. It wasn't, it was a cage. Moment the shackle closed I lost my voice. Lost my place at court. Woke up 3 days later in these woods with no memory of how I got here and a mark on my hand that had gone dark as ash. He looked up at her then. Gray eyes steady even though his hand had begun, very slightly, to shake. I have Spencer since being told, by everyone who ever mattered, that I am cursed. That the moon goddess turned her back on me. That my own blood rejected the crown. He underlined the next line twice. None of it was ever true. A man I trusted and a piece of iron he wanted me to wear forever. Ren reached across the table. Didn't touch his hand, not yet. Just laid her palm flat beside, close enough that the warmth of it would reach him without asking anything in return. Then we don't go to the capital because he asked us to, she said, quiet certain. We go because it's time someone asked him a few questions of their own. Something shifted behind Kellen's eyes, not quite a smile, but close enough to be its cousin. He nodded. They left the cabin 2 mornings later, not for the capital, not yet. Kellen had written that plan out carefully the night before. Page after page. The pencil moving faster than Wren had ever seen it move. And what it amounted to, once she'd read it through twice, was this. Don't walk into Crane's letter like an invitation. Walk in like a man who already knows it's a trap and has chosen deliberately to spring it on his own terms, which meant first they needed proof. Something beyond a slightly wrong curve of stars on a wax seal. Something that would hold up in front of a court full of nobles who had spent years being told a comfortable lie, and would not appreciate being asked to trade it for an uncomfortable truth. Which meant a detour, north first, to a border village called Halstead Crossing, where Kellen wrote that an old friend of his father still lived. A woman named Odessa Marsh, who had once served as royal archivist before Crane's regency quietly reassigned half the palace staff to postings so remote most of them never came back. If anyone kept records Crane wanted buried, Kellen wrote, it would be her. The road to Halstead Crossing wound through pine forest, thick enough to swallow the sun by early afternoon. Wren rode beside Kellen in the same black carriage, though this time he'd traded the single gray horse for 2, and this time, she noticed, he kept one hand near the long knife strapped inside his coat the entire way. Because whoever had been watching the cabin for 3 days hadn't stopped watching once they left it. She felt it too now. That particular pressure at the back of the neck that comes from being observed by something that doesn't want to be seen doing the observing. Someone's following us, she said, halfway through the second day. Kellen didn't look surprised. He nodded once, kept his eyes on the tree line. How long? He held up one finger, then pointed back the way they'd come. Since the letter arrived, Halstead Crossing turned out to be smaller than Wren expected. A handful of houses clustered around a frozen well, smoke rising thin from chimneys, the kind of place that existed mostly to be forgotten by anyone with real power. Odessa Marsh's cottage sat at the edge of the village, half buried in shutters closed against the cold and, Wren suspected, against considerably more than the cold. Kellen knocked 3 times, paused. Knocked twice more, a code. Which meant this wasn't the first time he'd used it. The door opened on a woman somewhere past 60, silver hair pulled back tight, eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She looked at Kellen for a long moment. Then at the mark he'd already uncovered on the back of his hand, held up without a word, the way he'd learned to speak in a language made entirely of proof. Odessa's whole face changed. Your Grace. Barely a whisper. Then glancing past him at Wren. Sharper, inside, both of you, quickly. Before someone in this village decides their loyalty is worth more than their silence. Inside the cottage smelled of dried herbs and old paper. Shelves lined every wall, stuffed with ledgers and scrolls. The private library of a woman who had spent decades making sure the truth had somewhere to live even after the people in power tried to bury it. Odessa poured tea with hands that trembled slightly. Not from realized, but from something closer to fear held at bay through sheer force of habit. 5 years, she said, setting the cups down. 5 years I've wondered if you were alive. Crane told the court you'd fled north in shame, unfit to rule. A voice stolen by the moon goddess herself as punishment for some sin no one could name. Kellen wrote quickly, slid the notebook across the table. Tell me what really happened, everything you know. Odessa's mouth tightened. The binding ritual that took your voice. Her eyes flicked briefly to Wren, gauging how much to say in front of a stranger, then apparently deciding the mark on Kellen's hand vouched for whoever he'd chosen to bring. It isn't a real tradition. I searched every archive I had access to before they reassigned me out here. There's no record of any king ever being bound that way. Not once, not in 400 years of succession. She reached beneath the table, pulled out a small locked box, opened it with a key she wore on a cord around her neck, inside a single fold document, edges worn soft with handling. I found this before they sent me away. A commission. For a silversmith in the lower quarter. Paid for privately. Not through the treasury. She unfolded it carefully, revealing careful cramped handwriting. For a shackle, bound with old moon iron and a binding charm keyed to royal blood. Commissioned 6 months before your father died. Wren felt the room go very still. 6 months before his father died.
Kellen's hand, when he reached for the document,
was not steady at all. He planned it, Wren said quietly. Before your father was even gone. He planned all of it. Odessa nodded, grim. The commission bears a name. Not Crane's, of course. He's too careful for that. But the silversmith's ledger, which I also happen to have a copy of, notes who came to collect the finished piece. She pulled a second smaller paper from the box, slid it across. A name written plainly, no code, no disguise. Because whoever collected the shackle had never imagined anyone would think to check. Aldrich Crane. They stayed in Halstead Crossing only one night, because one night was already too long, Kellen wrote. Once they were alone again in the small guest room Odessa had offered. Every hour we stay is an hour Crane's watchers have to report where we are. Wren sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the documents folded carefully inside her coat, and watched him pace the length of the small room like a man trying to outwalk his own thoughts. We have proof now, she said. The commission, the ledger. His name in his own silversmith's records. Kellen nodded. But something, in his shoulders, zasn't? He stopped pacing. Wrote slowly. Proof means nothing if he controls who's allowed to hear it. Years he's sat on that throne. Years building loyalty, rewarding silence, punishing anyone who asked the wrong question. I walk into that court with paper in my hand and he simply says I forged it myself, out of jealousy. Out of madness brought on by the very curse he invented. Wren considered that, turned it over. Then we don't walk into his court, she said finally. We make him walk into ours. Kellen looked at her. You said the shackle is keyed to royal blood. She went on, thinking it through as she spoke. Faster now, the pieces sliding into place the way herbs did, when she used to sort them by what they cured and what they killed and how close always. Those two lists sat to each other, which means whoever made it understood exactly how it worked. Which means it can be unmade the same way, by someone who understands it just as well. She held his gaze. You cracked it once already. In the cabin when I asked you to stop hiding. Something shifted behind his eyes. What if the rest of it isn't broken by magic at all, Wren said. What if it's broken the same way any lock is broken, by understanding exactly what it was built to fear? Kellen stared at her a long moment. Then he opened the notebook again. Wrote 4 words, underlined hard enough to nearly tear the page. I know what it fears. They left Halstead Crossing before dawn. Not toward the capital, not yet. East instead, toward the ruin of what had once been the old royal hunting lodge. Abandoned since before Kellen's father's time, far enough from any village that no one would think to look there. Close enough to the border that they could reach it inside 2 days. Because if the shackle had been built to fear something, Kellen had written the night before, sliding the page across so Wren could read it by candlelight, then somewhere in that lodge, in the old private study his father had used for exactly this kind of work, there would be answers. His father had studied binding magic his whole life. Not to use it, to understand how to undo it should anyone ever try to use it against the crown. Crane knew that too, Kellen had written. Which is exactly why no one has set foot in that lodge in 5 years. The ride east was harder than the ride north had been. Colder for one thing, the wind picking up sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Snow deepening until the horses waded through it more than walked. And harder in another way too, the way Wren noticed Kellen watching the tree line more and more often, his hand never far from the knife at his side. His whole body carrying the particular alertness of a man who has learned, the hard way, exactly how quiet danger can be before it announces itself. They made camp the first night in the shelter of a rock outcropping. Fire kept low and more warmth than light, because light traveled, and neither of them wanted to advertise exactly where they'd stopped. Wren sat close to the flame, hands out toward it, and found herself, for the first time since the wedding, thinking not about survival but about the strange shape her life had taken in the space of 2 weeks. Can I ask you something, she said. Kellen looked up from where he was sharpening the knife against a whetstone, slow, methodical strokes. That first day at the chapel. She pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. You didn't know me. You'd never spoken to me. Why me? He set the knife down, thought about it a long moment before reaching for the notebook. I'd seen you before market day, 3 years back. You gave your bread to a boy who'd had his stolen. Didn't ask his name, didn't ask for thanks. Just gave it and walked away like it cost you nothing. Even though I could see it cost you everything. Wren felt something tighten in her throat. I remembered that. Years of people bowing to a crest and forgetting the person underneath it. And I remembered a girl who gave away her own bread to a stranger and expected nothing back. He looked at her across the small fire. I didn't offer to marry a stranger that day. I offered to marry the only person I'd seen in years who reminded me people could still be kind without being asked to. Wren didn't trust her voice for a moment. When she found it again, it came out rougher than she meant. I gave away that bread because I knew what it felt like to have something stolen and have no one care. Kellen nodded wrote one more line before closing the notebook for the night. I know. That's exactly why it mattered. They reached the hunting lodge on the evening of the second day. It sat in a small valley half swallowed by pine and drifted snow, roof sagging in one corner where a storm years back had cracked a beam and no one had ever come to fix it. Windows dark. Door hanging slight loose on old hinges. Abandoned. Exactly as Kellen had said. Except the snow around the front step had been disturbed recently. Boot prints. At least 3 sets. Leading up to the door and, more troubling, not leading back away from it. Kellen went very still beside her. He drew the knife without a sound. Motioned for her to stay back, stay low, stay fast, said tree line until he'd checked the lodge himself. Ren didn't listen. Because years of being told to stay back, stay quiet, stay out of the way had taught her exactly one lesson. And it wasn't the lesson anyone had intended. She followed him at a careful distance, keeping to the shadows the way she'd learned to move through the Halden kitchen without being noticed. And watched him push the door open with the flat of his hand. Inside, dust, cobwebs, furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts standing patient in the dark. And in the center of the main hall, arranged with obvious deliberate care, 3 lit candles burning steady despite the draft that should have snuffed them out hours ago. A message waiting. Kellen crossed to it slowly. Ren followed, close enough now that she saw it too. Written not on paper but carved directly into the old wooden table. Fresh cuts. The wood pale where the blade had bitten deep. 5 words, I always find you first. Tack came before either of them could react. Ren heard it before she saw it. A whistle through the cold air that some animal part of her recognized as danger a full half-second before her mind caught up, and she threw herself sideways on instinct alone, hitting the dusty floor hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. The arrow that would have taken her in the throat buried itself instead in the old wooden doorframe, silver shaft stowels humming faintly with the force of the impact. Kellen. He was already moving. Already between her and the door, knife out, body angled to shield her from whatever came next. And what came next was Crane's men, 6 of them at least, pouring through the lodge's broken windows and shattered door, with the coordinated efficiency of soldiers who had clearly been waiting, patient, for exactly this moment. Your Grace voice from the doorway, mocking the title. A man in dark leathers, silver pin at his collar marking him as one of Crane's men at all. The Regent sends his regards. And his apologies. He'd hoped you'd come quietly. Kellen didn't answer. Didn't need to. He moved instead fast, brutal, efficient in a way that told Ren more about the years he'd spent surviving alone in these woods than any letter or ledger ever could. The first man went down before he'd fully cleared the window. The second barely got his blade up before Kellen disarmed him with a move too quick for Ren to follow, the knife spinning free, clattering across the floor. But there were 6 of them and 1 of him. And Ren's still on the ground, still trying to bars back into her lungs. Ren. His voice. Cracking on the single syllable of her name, like something breaking free after being sealed too long. She looked up. Their eyes met across the chaos of the fight, and in that half-second she understood 2 things that he had just spoken for the first time since she'd met him, and that he had done it because he was afraid, genuinely afraid, that this might be the last chance he'd have to say anything at all. Behind you, she screamed instead of answering, because a soldier had circled wide, blade raised, closing on Kellen's blind side. He turned just in time, not quite fast enough. The blade caught his shoulder, tearing through coat and skin both, and Kellen staggered, grunting, but didn't go down. Didn't stop. Turned the pain into momentum and drove the man back with a strike hard enough to end the fight. 4 down now. 2 left, and one of those 2, the leather-clad leader in the doorway, was reaching for something at his belt Ren hadn't noticed before. Small silver-tipped bolt already loaded. The Regent said if you wouldn't come quietly. The man raising it, aiming not at Kellen's chest but lower, at the shackle still visible where his sleeve had torn during the fight. He'd settle for making sure you never leave these woods able to prove anything at all. The bolt fired. Ren didn't think. She threw herself forward, hands out, some instinct older than reason screaming at her to do something, anything, and the bolt that should have struck the shackle dead center, caught instead at an angle, glancing, burying itself in Kellen's forearm just above the iron itself. He made a sound Ren had never heard from him before. Not quite a scream, something worse, lower, torn straight from so deep and old, and the shackle began to glow. Not the pale warning glow from the cabin. White, blinding, wrong. The remaining 2 soldiers fled. Whatever loyalty they carried for Crane apparently didn't extend to standing in a room with whatever was happening to Kellen's arm. Ren didn't watch them go. She was already at his side, hands shaking as she gripped his shoulders, trying to keep him upright as his knees started to buckle. Kellen, look at me. His eyes were glassy. Sweat beading along his hairline despite the cold. The shackle burned white-hot now, and where the silver bolt had pierced skin near the metal, dark lines were already spreading beneath the surface, thin as ink dropped in water, tracing up toward his elbow. Silver poison. Means specifically, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach, to interact with moon iron. Mean to be lethal only to someone wearing exactly the kind of shackle he wore. Crane's men hadn't come to capture him. They'd come to kill him. And make it look like the curse at last had finally finished what it started. Stay with me. Her voice cracked on the words. Stay with, do you hear me? You don't get to do this now. Not after everything. He caught her wrist. Weak words out through gritted teeth. Voice raw and unpracticed but unmistakably his own. Bag, a breath. Left. Saddle. She didn't waste time asking why. Sprinted out to where they'd left the horses. Tore open the saddlebag with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. And found, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, a small collection of dried herbs and a stoppered vial of something dark and thick. By the time she got back inside, Kellen had slid down against the wall, breathing ragged, the dark lines nearly to his shoulder now. Ren knelt beside him, unstoppered the vial, smelled it, wolfsbane root diluted. Meant to slow a poison, not cure, she realized instantly, recognizing the preparation from her years sorting herbs in the Halden still room, cataloging which plants healed and which plants killed, with barely a hair's difference between the two doses. This will buy time, she said, more to herself than him. Not enough. I need something to draw the silver out, not just slow it. Her eyes fell on the dried herbs, recognized 3 of the 5 instantly. The other 2 she didn't know, unfamiliar shapes, unfamiliar smell, and for one terrible second panic closed cold fingers around her throat. 'Cause if she guessed wrong, if she made the wrong choice with unfamiliar herbs on a man already dying in front of her.
Stop.
She forced
Forced her hand steady.
Because panicking wouldn't save him, only thinking would. She examined the unfamiliar herbs more closely. One had a faint silver sheen along the underside of its moon-touched, she realized. Grown specifically to counter moon iron poisoning, which meant Kellen, or whoever had packed that saddlebag for him, had known this exact danger might come. Which meant he'd been prepared for this. Even if he hadn't told her. You knew, she said, crushing the moon-touched leaves between her palms, working them into a paste with the wolfsbane. You knew Crane might try silver poison, that's why you carry this. Kellen's eyes had gone unfocused, but he managed a small, exhausted nod.
Why didn't you tell me?
His lips moved, barely a whisper. Didn't want you afraid. She almost laughed, except laughing felt too close to breaking entirely. I married a cursed man in front of a chapel full of people who wanted me dead by nightfall. I think I can handle being afraid, Kellen. She pressed the paste directly against the wound, working fast now, binding it tight with a strip torn from her own sleeve. The dark line slowed almost immediately, the frantic spread of silver poison meeting resistance for the first time since the bolt struck. But slowing wasn't stopping. I need to draw it out, she murmured, thinking fast, running through everything she knew, every plant, every combination, every disaster she'd narrowly avoided back in the still room, when a measurement went wrong and someone nearly paid for it. The shackle. It's reacting to the silver because it's keyed to fear it. Which means the metal itself might help pull toward the surface if I can just. She looked up at him. Trust me. He held her gaze, pain-glazed but present, and nodded once. Ren pressed her palm flat against the iron shackle itself, ignoring the heat radiating off it, murmuring the old herbwife's rhyme her own foster mother had taught her once. Half medicine, half prayer, meant to focus the mind as much as the remedy. Draw the poison to the light. Draw the shadow from the bone. Let the burden find its exit. Let the body walk alone. Nothing happened for a long, terrible moment. Then the shackle's glow shifted, from blinding white to something softer, almost gold, and beneath her palm she felt the metal cool by degrees, the frantic heat of it settling like a fever finally breaking. The dark lines beneath Kellen's skin began slowly, unmistakable, to recede. He exhaled, long and shuddering, head falling back against the wall. Ren.
Rough, barely audible but real.
Actual sound formed by his own voice for the second time in one impossible night. I'm here. She didn't let go of his hand. I'm not going anywhere. His eyes found hers. Something raw and unguarded there, stripped of years of careful silence. Thank you, he whispered. They didn't move again that night. Couldn't. Kellen was too weak to travel. The poison drained but not entirely gone, his body needing rest more than distance, and Ren wasn't about to risk moving him before she was certain the danger had genuinely passed. She built up the fire in the old hearth despite the risk of the light being seen. Reasoned correctly, she hoped. that Crane's remaining soldiers had already fled far enough that a small fire in an abandoned lodge wouldn't draw them back tonight. Not after watching whatever they just witnessed happen to the shackle. She sat beside him through the long hours of darkness, watching his breathing steady by degrees, watching the color slowly return to skin gone gray with poison and shock. Near dawn, his eyes opened again, clearer now, and found her still sitting there. You didn't sleep, his voice still rough from disuse but steadier now. Neither did you until about an hour ago, a ghost of something like a smile. Different reasons. She almost laughed. Instead she reached for the notebook more out of habit than necessity now, and found she didn't actually need it. He could speak. However raw, however unused, the words still felt in his mouth, catching sometimes, slowing sometimes on a hard consonant like a man relearning to walk on a leg that had been asleep too long. He could speak now. How long, she asked instead, since you last used your voice? Before tonight, I mean. He was quiet a long moment, gathering the words the way a man gathers strength before standing. 5 years, slow, careful. Like each word had to be relearned from scratch. The binding took more than my crown. Crane made sure of that. Silence, so no one at court would hear me name him if I ever found the strength to accuse him. But you just spoke, twice. Before the poison even started to clear, something flickered across his face. Not quite to wonder. Fear breaks it, he said slowly, working it out even as he said it aloud. The binding is keyed to protect the crown from threat. When I thought, he stopped, started again. When I thought you were in danger. When the poison hit and I thought I might lose you before I ever told you. He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Ren felt something in her chest crack open, gentle and terrifying all at once. Told me what? He held her gaze steady despite how exhausted he clearly was. That I chose you at that chapel for more reasons than I let myself say out loud. That watching you plead for wolfsbane paced over my dying arm was somehow the most certain I've felt about anything in years, and breath caught. That's not Akla, she managed, the confession I expected tonight. No. A real smile, now small, exhausted, but real. Neither did I. They stayed at the lodge 2 more days. Long enough for Kellen's strength to return in full, the poison's last traces finally burning out of his blood, color coming back into his face by careful degrees the way frost retreats from a windows once the sun finally commits to rising. Long enough for Ren to properly explore the old study his father had used, a room she hadn't dared enter that first chaotic night, tucked at the back of the lodge behind a door that stuck stubbornly in its frame, swollen with years of damp and disuse. Inside, shelves of books on subjects she'd never imagined a king might need to understand. Binding magics, blood charms. The old careful sciences of oath and consequence that most people in the kingdom had reduced, over generations, to superstition and half-remembered nursery warnings. Your father studied all this, she said, running her fingers along cracked leather spines, careful of the dust. Not to use it, you said that already, to understand how to undo it. Kellen nodded, moving slowly through the room beside her, something almost reverent in the way he touched the old furniture, like a man visiting a grave he hadn't been allowed to grieve at properly the first time. He believed power like this, Kellen said, was only ever safe in the hands of someone who'd studied exactly how it could be turned into a weapon. He used to say a king who doesn't understand his own vulnerabilities is a king who's already lost, whether he knows it yet or not. He sounds like he would have liked me, said, half-joke, mostly not. Something soft moved across Kellen's face. He would have liked you enormously. He always said the court had too many people who'd learned to survive by disappearing into the walls, and not nearly enough who knew how to actually see a room clearly. They found the false panel on the second afternoon, hidden behind a bookshelf that swung, with effort, on a hinge disguised as ordinary woodgrain. Behind it, a locked chest of documents even Crane's men hadn't found. Inside, proof beyond proof. Correspondence between the old king and his most trusted advisors, discussing binding magic and its dangers, warning explicitly against ever using it on royal blood without full council consent. A private letter from Kellen's father, written not long before his death, expressing growing unease about Crane's increasing influence over palace affairs. And most damning of all, a second copy of the silversmith's commission, this one bearing not just Crane's name but his personal seal, pressed in wax exactly matching the one on the false summons letter, proving beyond any court's doubt that Crane himself had authored both. He's been planning this since before your father died, Ren said, laying the documents out across the old desk. The commission, the binding, even the letter inviting you home, all of it, one long plan he's been running for years. Kellen studied the papers in silence a long moment. Then it's time, he said finally. Voice steadier now than she'd heard it since the poison. We go finish what he started. The capital. He nodded. Not to answer his summons like a man walking into a trap. His eyes found hers something fierce and certain settling behind them. To walk in as the king he tried to erase. With proof he can't argue away. And with the one person who's proven over and over that she's stronger than anyone in that palace ever gave her credit for being. Ren felt her throat tighten. Together then, she said. Together, he agreed. The ride toward the capital took 4 days. 4 days of careful travel, avoiding main roads where Crane's men might still be watching. 4 days of Kellen's voice growing steadier with every mile, the words coming easier now, though he still paused sometimes mid-sentence, still reached for the notebook out of old habit before catching himself and simply speaking instead. On the third night, camped in a shallow cave that offered decent shelter from the wind, Ren found herself studying him across the small fire, still half amazed by the sound of his voice, still adjusting to a version of him that could simply say what he meant instead of writing it down. Can I ask you something else, she said. He looked up. You can ask me anything now. That's rather the point of having a voice back, she almost smiled. The night the shackle first cracked. Back at the cabin. What did you almost say? Your lips moved. Like a word was right there. Kellen was quiet a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise and vanish into the dark. Your name, he said finally. I wanted to say your name. Because in that moment, watching you refuse to be afraid of me, refuse to leave even when I told you to stay away, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand in years of silence. What's that? He looked up, firelight catching the gray of his eyes, softening them somehow. That I'd rather have my voice back for one reason more than any other. Just to be able to say it. Ren. Her name spoken deliberately now, unhurried, no poison forcing it free this time, no fear driving it out of him. Just him. Choosing it. She didn't trust herself what to answer right away. When she finally did, her voice came out softer than she intended. I'm glad you got it back, she said. Not just for the throne. For this too. But peace they both understood wouldn't last long. Because 2 days from the capital, riding through a narrow mountain pass thick with fresh snow, they came across the first sign that Crane already knew exactly where they were heading. A checkpoint. Manned heavily, with soldiers wearing not just Crane's silver pin but the royal crest itself, worn now with a confidence that told Ren more clearly than any letter could exactly how thoroughly the regent had convinced the kingdom he ruled by right. And standing at the front of that checkpoint, unmistakable even at a distance, wrapped now in a fine wool coat far too expensive for a man of his supposed station. Garrett Sorrel. Ren's stomach dropped. What is he doing here? Kellen's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing on the checkpoint ahead. Making himself useful to whoever holds power. That's always been Garrett's particular talent. They pulled the horses to a stop at a safe distance, weighing options neither of them liked much. Straight through the checkpoint meant confrontation. And confrontation, this close to the capital with this many of Crane's men gathered, meant real risk. Around it meant losing days circling through unfamiliar terrain, days they weren't certain they had. There Kellen pointed to a narrow game trail branching off through the trees, barely visible beneath the snow. Sleeds around the ridge, rougher going, but it should avoid the checkpoint entirely. They'd barely turned the horses toward it when a voice rang out behind them, carrying easily across the cold still air. Leaving so soon, Garrett. He'd spotted them. Was already crossing toward them at an unhurried pace, flanked by 2 of Crane's soldiers, the confidence in his stride belonging to a man who believed, entirely, that he now stood it on the winning side of whatever conflict was about to unfold. Kellen's hand moved toward his knife. Wait, she murmured. Let me. He glanced at her, surprised, but after a moment's hesitation nodded. Ren turned to face Garrett as he approached, chin lifted, refusing to let years of learned smallness creep back into her spine now. Not after everything the last weeks had taught her about exactly how much weight she was actually capable of carrying. Garrett. E-controlled working for Crane now? That's a new low, even for you. His smile was thin. Practiced. The kind of smile men wore when they'd convinced themselves cruelties was simply pragmatism wearing better clothes. The regent pays considerably better than the Halden household ever did, Ren. And unlike some people, his eyes flicked pointedly to Kellen. He understands the value of loyalty properly rewarded. Loyalty, Kellen said, voice low, dangerous in a way Ren hadn't heard from him before. Bought from a man like you isn't loyalty. It's rent, and rent always comes due. Garrett's smile flickered, just slightly before he recovered it. Big words for a man who spent 5 years unable to speak a single one of them. I have my voice back now, Kellen said simply. I'd suggest you get used to hearing exactly what I have to say. For a moment something like genuine uncertainty crossed Garrett's face. Then he seemed to remember the soldiers flanking him, remember the checkpoint at his back, and the confidence returned, brittle but present. The Regent knows you're coming, he said. Knows about your little detour to Halstead Crossing. Knows about the old hunting lodge and whatever you think you found there. He shook his head, almost pitying. You can't win this, Ashgrove. Years of loyalty doesn't unravel because you found a few old papers and got your voice back through some herbwitch trick. Wren's spine stiffened at herbwitch, but she kept her voice level. We're not asking you to believe us, Garrett. We're just asking you to get out of the way. He studied her a long moment, something almost like genuine confusion crossing his features. Like he was seeing her clearly for the first time, and couldn't quite reconcile it with the version of her he'd spent years dismissing. You've changed, he said finally, quieter. Some of the performance dropping away. No, Wren said. I've just stopped. People like you convinced me I was small. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Garrett's jaw tightened and whatever brief crack had shown in his composure sealed back over. Take them, he said to the soldiers flanking him. The Regent wants them brought in alive, preferably compliant. The soldiers moved forward. Kellen's knife was already in his hand. The fight that followed was short, brutal, and entirely one-sided in a direction Garrett clearly hadn't anticipated. Kellen moved with the same brutal efficiency he'd shown at the lodge, disarming the first soldier in 3 swift motions, using the man's own momentum to send him sprawling into a snowbank hard enough to leave him gasping and still. The second soldier fared little better. Kellen's knife catching his blade and twisting it free before he'd fully registered the fight had started. Garrett, for his part, didn't draw a weapon at all. Simply stood frozen, watching a man he'd spent years dismissing as broken and voiceless dismantle 2 trained soldiers without breaking a visible sweat. You're not going to fight? Kellen asked, breathing hard but steady, knife still. Garrett's throat worked. I'm not a fighter, Ashgrove. I'm a negotiator. Then negotiate, Kellen said. Tell your Regent his men couldn't hold a mountain checkpoint against one voiceless curse and an orphan girl he spent years calling worthless. See how that particular report sits with him. Garrett's eyes flicked between them, calculating the particular arithmetic of a man weighing exactly how much longer his current loyalty remained profitable. He'll kill me if I let you through, he said finally. He'll kill you eventually regardless, Wren said, quiet but certain. Men like Crane don't keep loyal servants around once they've stopped being useful. You've seen enough of how power actually works to know that's true. Something shifted behind Garrett's eyes. Not quite capitulation, but close enough to hesitation that Wren pressed the advantage. Let us through, she said. And when this is finished, when the truth comes out about what Crane actually did, you have a choice about which side of history you're standing on. That's more than most people in your position get offered. For a long moment, Garrett said nothing at all. Then slowly he stepped aside. The trail's clear, he said, voice tight. For now, I'd suggest you move quickly. I won't be able to explain this delay for long. Kellen studied him a moment longer, knife still ready, weighing whether to trust the sudden shift. Finally he lowered the blade. Thank you, Wren said quietly. Garrett didn't answer. Just watched them rise, expression unreadable. Something that might have been regret or might have simply been fear flickering briefly across his face before he turned away. They made camp that night well past the checkpoint, deep enough into the mountain trail that pursuit seemed unlikely, at least until morning. Wren sat close to the fire, still processing the day, still turning over the strange, brittle uncertainty she'd seen in Garrett's eyes. Do you think he'll actually stay quiet? She asked. Kellen considered the question seriously before answering. I think Garrett has spent his whole life betting on whoever seems most likely to win. Right now he's genuinely unsure which side that is. That uncertainty might buy us more time than any threat could have. That's oddly generous of you, considering he humiliated me in front of an entire chapel not so long ago. Kellen's expression softened, something gentler than his usual careful calm. I'm not being generous toward Garrett. I'm being honest about what fear does to men who've never had to feel it before. He's afraid now. Genuinely, for the first time. That fear is worth more to us than any loyalty he might have offered. They sat quietly a while after that, the fire burning low, neither of them in any particular hurry to break the peace. Can I tell you something? Wren said eventually, that I haven't told anyone. Not even you, not properly. Kellen looked at her, giving her his full attention the way he always did now. The particular attentiveness of a man who had spent years learning to listen carefully because speaking had once been taken from him. When Garrett left me at that altar, she said, some ugly part of me was almost relieved. Isn't that strange? I'd spent my whole life being told I should be grateful for whatever scraps of belonging the Haldens offered me, and some part of me had actually started believing it. Believing that marrying Garrett, being tolerated by his family instead of merely housed by them, was the best future I could reasonably expect. And now I understand the difference between being tolerated and being chosen, Ren said. I don't think I ever really understood it before you walked through those chapel doors. I thought survival was the same thing as a life. It isn't, not even close. Kellen was quiet a moment, turning something over behind his eyes. I understand that difference too in my own way. Crane never once asked what I wanted. Not really. He decided what was best for the kingdom, decided what role I should play in that vision, and expected gratitude for the privilege of being managed instead of heard. He looked at her steadily. You've never once tried to manage me. Even when you disagreed with my choices. Even at the lodge when I told you to stay back and you didn't listen. I'd apologize for that, Ren said. Except I'm not actually sorry. You'd be dead if I'd listened. A real laugh escaped him, warm and unguarded. The particular sound of a man who had learned, slowly and against considerable odds, that laughter still belonged to him too. No, he said, I suppose I wouldn't be. The fire crackled low between them, and outside the small camp, snow continued its patient work of covering every trace of the road they'd already traveled, leaving only the road still ahead, uncertain, dangerous, and somehow, despite everything, worth walking toward together. On the last full day before the capital, they passed through a small farming settlement clustered along a frozen creek, smoke rising thin from a dozen chimneys. The kind of place too small to appear on any proper map. A child's cry pulled Ren off the road before she'd fully decided to stop. A woman knelt in the snow outside a modest farmhouse, holding a boy of perhaps 6 against her chest, his breathing thin and wheezing, lips gone faintly blue at the edges. A man, presumably the father, hovered uselessly nearby, hands opening and closing on nothing. The particular helplessness of someone watching a disaster he doesn't have the tools to stop. Ren was off the horse before Kellen had fully registered what she was doing. How long has he been like this? She asked, already kneeling, already reaching for the boy's wrist to check his pulse, the way she'd been taught years ago in the Halden stillroom, back when her only value to that household had been exactly this kind of quiet, unglamorous competence. Since this morning, the mother said, voice cracking. The healer's 2 villages over. We sent for him, but 2 villages over might as well be a lifetime at this rate. Ren pressed 2 fingers gently beneath the boy's jaw, felt the pulse thin and rapid beneath his fevered skin. Winter lung, I've seen it before, it moves fast in small chests. She turned to Kellen, who had already dismounted, already reading the urgency in her posture without needing to be told. My saddlebag, she said, the blue satchel. Quickly, he didn't ask questions, simply moved, fast and efficient, the way he moved through anything that required exactly that. Ren worked with hands that didn't shake this time. The particular steadiness that comes not from the absence of fear, but from enough practice that fear no longer gets to make the final decision. Crushed dried mullein leaf into the boy's water, added a careful pinch of ground ginger root to open his airways, pressed a warmed cloth soaked in eucalyptus oil against his small chest, while murmuring instructions to the terrified mother about keeping him upright, keeping him warm, never letting him lie flat until the wheezing eased. Minutes passed. The boy's breathing, ragged and shallow at first, began slowly to deepen. By the time the color returned fully to his lips, the father had sunk to his knees in the snow beside his wife, both of them watching Ren with an expression she recognized instantly, having worn something close to it herself once, and the particular disbelieving gratitude of people who'd expected the worst and been handed something else instead. Who are you? The mother whispered, truly. Hesitated, glancing at Kellen, who only watched her with something warm and unguarded in his expression, offering no answer of his own, leaving the choice, as he always did, entirely hers to make. Someone who used to sort herbs for a family that never once thanked her for it, Ren said finally. It's good practice apparently, for exactly this. They left supplies enough to last the boy through his recovery, refused the coin the father tried to press into Kellen's hand, and rode on toward the capital as the sun began its slow winter descent behind the tree line. You didn't have to stop, Kellen said. After a while, though there was no real question in it, more an observation offered quietly into the cold evening air. I know, Sren said. But knowing something and being able to walk past it anyway aren't the same thing. I spent too many years being the person nobody stopped for. I'm not interested in becoming the kind of person who doesn't stop for anyone else. Kellen was quiet a long moment, watching the road ahead. Something working behind his expression that Ren couldn't quite name. That's the kind of queen this kingdom has never had, he said finally. Someone who stops. 2 more days brought them within sight of the capital itself. Ren had never seen it before, not in person, only heard it described in market gossip, and half-remembered stories from travelers passing through Silverpine. The reality of it. Spires rising pale against the winter sky. Walls thick enough to have weathered 100 years of siege. Banners snapping in the wind bearing the crowned wolf crest she now understood belonged, by every right that mattered, to the man riding silently beside her. Struck her with a weight she hadn't fully anticipated. It's beautiful, she said softly. Kellen's expression, studying the city he hadn't seen in years, was harder to read. Something between longing and dread. It was beautiful when I left, he said. I don't know what Crane's rule has done to it since. They made camp one final night in the forest just beyond the capital's outer farmland, close enough now that the smoke from countless chimneys smudged the horizon, far enough still to plan without being seen. Tomorrow, Kellen said, spreading the documents from the hunting lodge across a flat stone between them, studying them by firelight time. We don't sneak in. We don't hide. We walk through the main gate, in daylight, with every piece of proof we've gathered, and we make Crane answer for what he's done in front of the entire court. He'll try to stop us before we ever reach the throne room, Ren said. He'll try, Kellen agreed. But he's spent years convincing an entire kingdom I'm either dead or too broken to matter. He's not prepared for a version of me that has proof, a voice, and someone at his side he never accounted for. That last part, I suspect, is the piece that will unsettle him most of all. Ren felt some steady settle in her chest, some quiet certainty she hadn't expected to find this deep into danger. Whatever tomorrow held, she understood now she would not be facing it as the girl left shaking at an altar. She would be facing it as someone who had already survived poison pursuit, and a chapel full of cruelty, and had come through all of it still standing, still choosing, still herself. Then let's go remind him exactly what he forgot to account for, she said. Kellen looked at her a long moment, firelight catching something raw and grateful in his expression. Together, he said again. The word carrying more weight now than it had the first time he'd said it, days ago, in the ruin of his father's old study. Together, Ren agreed. But together she'd learned by now required more than resolve. It required a plan specific enough to survive contact with a man who had spent years perfecting exactly how to control a room before anyone else understood the room had already been decided. Walk me through it again, she said, pulling her knees up toward the fire. Everything that could go wrong tomorrow. I want to hear it out loud. Not just carried around in your head where I can't help you carry it. Kellen considered that a long moment, the particular consideration of a man unused to sharing the weight of a plan with anyone at all. He'll try to discredit the proof first, he said slowly. Call it forged. That's the easiest lie and the one requiring the least evidence on his part. If that fails, he'll try to discredit you. A stranger at my side conveniently arrived just as I found my voice again. He'll paint you as opportunistic. Or worse. Let him try, Ren said. I've survived worse insults than anything Crane can invent on short notice. If both of those fail, Kellen continued, he'll try to stall. Demand time. Convene a council review that drags on for months, long enough for doubt to settle back over the whole court, long enough for him to quietly consolidate whatever loyalty he has left. And if that fails too, Kellen's jaw tightened, then he stops being careful. A man who's spent years building something doesn't watch it collapse without eventually reaching for whatever weapon is closest, however desperate it makes him look. Ren studied him across the fire, turning the shape of that over in her mind. Which is exactly why we need witnesses who aren't just documents. Paper he can call forged. A person standing in front of the entire court saying it happened is harder to Kellen said. Odessa, Ren agreed. But not only her. If Crane built 5 years of fear into that palace, there will be others who've been waiting just as long as she has for someone brave enough to ask the right question at the right moment. We simply need to make sure the moment is big enough and public enough that staying silent finally costs more than speaking does. Something shifted in Kellen's expression, equal parts surprise and something warmer underneath it. You've been thinking about this as carefully as I have. I spent years learning to read a room before it turned dangerous, said simply. This is just a bigger room. They spent the rest of that final evening refining it together, piece by piece. The particular quiet intimacy of two people building something neither of them could have built alone. Until the plan sat between them not as a single man's careful strategy but as something genuinely shared, tested from every angle either of them could imagine, before the fire burned low and the cold finally drove them both toward whatever rest they could manage before morning. The main gate of the capital rose out of the morning mist like something out of a story.
Ren had never quite believed as a child. Stone towers.
Iron portcullis. Banner snapping overhead. The crowned wolf stitched into deep blue cloth. 7 stars circling a crest that belonged, by blood and by right, to the man riding beside her. Once we're through the gate, Kellen, steady. There's no undoing it. Crane will know within the hour, maybe faster I know. Once the court sees the proof, sees me, sees you standing beside me. He paused, because the sentence had gotten away from him a little. There's no version of this where we simply walk away after. Whatever happens today decides everything. Ren looked at the gate. At the guards stationed along the wall, spears heeing the pale winter light. At the city beyond, smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys, all of it belonging, in some sense, to the man who could barely believe he was allowed to claim it. She thought, briefly, of the girl who had once stood shaking at an altar, certain that nothing waiting beyond that day could possibly be worse than the humiliation already piled at her feet. That girl could never have imagined this. Could never have imagined a gate this tall, a crown this heavy, a choice this permanent waiting somewhere just past her own fear. But she wasn't that girl anymore. Hadn't been really since the moment she'd lifted her chin a mocking chapel and refused to let shame decide her worth for her. Then we don't walk away, she said. We walk in. The guard at the gate did not recognize him. Which made sense. Years is a long time. Long enough for memory to soften at the edges. Long enough for a face last seen at 23 to blur into something the mind fills in with rumor instead of fact. State your business, the guard said, spear and bored in the particular way of men who ask the same 40 times a day and have stopped expecting anything interesting to come of it. Kellen didn't answer with words. He pulled back his sleeve instead, let the pale winter light catch the mark on the back of his hand. Silver and midnight blue crown wolf, 7 stars. The guard's bored expression didn't just change, it collapsed. That stopped, started again. That's not possible. His grace has been gone years. Everyone knows what the regent told them, said, voice carrying now steady, deliberate, still catching faintly on the harder consonants, the voice of a man who had spent years choosing every single word because he'd had so few of them to spend. I'd like the chance to tell them something different. The guard's spear lowered. Slowly. Like his arm hadn't fully caught up with what his eyes were reporting. I need to send word ahead, he stammered. The court, they'll send word, Kellen said. I want Crane to know exactly who's coming. Word moved faster than they did. By the time they reached the wide cobbled avenue leading toward the palace proper, people had already begun gathering along the edges of the street. Whispers first, then more than whispers. A name passed mouth to mouth, disbelieving, then less disbelieving, then finally something closer to hope. Ashgrove, he's alive, he's come home. Ren rode beside him through the gathering crowd, feeling every eye that swept across her, every whispered question about who exactly this stranger was, riding beside a king nobody had expected to see again. An old woman near the front of the crowd fell to her knees as they passed. Not out of fear, out of something closer to relief. They remember you, Ren murmured. They remember who I was, Kellen said quietly. We're about to find out if that's enough. Ren studied the crowd as they rode deeper into the city, noting the particular mixture of hope and caution on so many faces, people who had learned, under years of careful rule, that hope offered too freely had a way of being punished later. She understood that caution instinctively, had worn it herself for most of her life. It would take more than one ride down one avenue to undo it fully. But watching it soften, even slight, in face after face they passed, she allowed herself to believe that undoing it was, at least, finally possible. Near the base of the great fountain at the avenue's center, an old man broke from the crowd, moving with the particular urgency of someone who has waited years for a chance he never expected to get. Your Grace. His voice cracked with age and emotion both. I served your father's household. Stable master, 30 years. I was told you died in the woods, cursed and forgotten. I lit a candle for you every winter since, not knowing if it mattered, not knowing if anyone in this world remembered you were worth mourning properly. Kellen reined in his horse, looked down at the old man with something raw moving behind his eyes. I remember you, Kellen said slowly, reaching back through years of fog and silence. You taught me to ride. Told me a king who couldn't sit a horse properly would never earn a soldier's respect, crown or no crown. The old man's tears breaking free. You remember? I remember everything, Kellen said. Every kindness anyone showed me before I disappeared. I intend to return every one of them, now that I finally have the chance. The old man stepped back, bowing low, and the gesture rippled outward through the crowd, one person after another following suit. Not out of fear this time, Ren realized, watching it happen, but out of something considerably warmer. Recognition. Relief. The particular emotion of people who had spent years being told a story they never fully believed, finally handed proof that the truth had been waiting all along, patient, for someone brave enough to bring it home. The palace gates opened before they reached them, which told Ren, more clearly than anything else could have, that Crane already knew. Had known since the border checkpoint, probably. Had known if she was honest with herself since the moment the false summons letter had failed to lure them quietly into a trap he could control. A man stood waiting in the palace courtyard. Tall silver at his temples. Robes rich enough to have been mistaken by anyone who hadn't studied the crest carefully for royal cloth itself. Aldrich Crane. He watched them approach with an expression Ren couldn't quite name. Not fear, exactly, something closer to calculation. The particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic in his head, weighing exactly how much danger had just ridden through his gates. Your Grace? Crane's voice was smooth. Practiced. The voice of a man who had spent years perfecting kind of the... We feared the worst when you didn't answer the summons directly. I'm relieved to see you well, are you? Kellen said. Flat. Not a question. Something flickered behind Crane's eyes. Gone almost before Ren caught it. Of course. Crane spread his hands, the picture of wounded innocence. I have prayed for your return every single day of this regency. It has been a burden I never wanted, held only out of duty to a throne that couldn't remain empty. A regency built on a lie, Kellen said, isn't duty, it's theft. The courtyard went very still. Around them guards had begun to... Court officials, drawn by the commotion, filtering out onto balconies and into doorways, watching the exchange with the particular hunger of people who sense, correctly, that they are witnessing history decide which direction to fall. Crane's smile didn't waver, but something behind it tightened. Careful, Your Grace, he said softly. Years alone in the woods can do strange things to a mind. Grief, isolate, shame, to admit the curse affected more than your voice. The curse, Kellen said, was never a curse at all. He reached into his coat, pulled out the folded documents, the commission, the ledger, the silversmith's record bearing Crane's own seal, and held them up for the gathering crowd to see. This is a commission, said, voice carrying now across the courtyard, for a shackle bound in moon iron. Ordered and paid for privately. 6 months before my father died, gasps rippled through the crowd. Crane's expression didn't change, but his hand, Ren noticed, had gone very still at his side. This is the silversmith's ledger, Kellen continued, recording who collected the finished piece. He turned the second document outward, Aldrich Crane. Written plainly, no disguise, no code. He planned this, Kellen said, before my father was even gone. He built the shackle that stole my voice. He built the lie that called it a curse, and he has spent years sitting on a throne that was never his to hold. For a long, terrible moment nobody moved. Then Crane laughed. Soft, controlled. But something underneath it, Ren thought, had cracked, however carefully he tried to hide it. A commission, he said. A ledger, paper, Your Grace. Paper can be forged. Paper can be planted by anyone clever enough and desperate enough to want a throne they were told they'd lost forever. Desperate, Kellen repeated. Is that the word you'd use for a man reclaiming what was stolen from him? I'd use it, Crane said, voice sharpening now, for a man who vanished into the woods years ago and returned with a stranger at his side and a story too convenient to trust. His eyes cut to Ren, cold and assessing. Some woods witch, who's convinced a broken man she can restore what a curse took? My wife, Kellen said. Simple. Fine. Ren Ashgrove. The woman who saved my life twice since the day I married her. And the person who noticed, before I did, that your summons' seal didn't quite match the one you wear on your own hand. Crane's gaze flicked involuntarily to the ring on his own finger. Just for a second. But Ren saw it. And judging by the murmur rippling through the watching court, she wasn't the only one. A forger's mistake, Kellen said quietly, made by a man who never expected anyone to look closely enough to catch it. Crane's composure, so carefully built over years, began to show real cracks now. This is absurd, he said, voice rising, losing some of its practiced smoothness. I have ruled this kingdom faithfully, fairly while you hid in the woods, unable to even speak for yourself. I have my voice back, Kellen said. I'd suggest you consider carefully what I intend to do with it. He turned, then, away from Crane, toward the gathered court, toward the officials and guards and curious citizens who had crowded into the courtyard to watch a kingdom's true history finally come due. Years ago, Kellen said, voice carrying clear and steady across the stone courtyard, I was told a binding ritual was tradition, that it would seal the crown to my bloodline until I proved myself ready to rule. I believed the man who told me that, because he had carried me on his shoulders as a child, because I had no reason then to imagine loyalty could be a costume worn over ambition. He held up the documents again. This is proof that ritual was never tradition, that it was built deliberately to silence me, to remove me from a throne I was never given the chance to properly claim, and to leave this kingdom in the hands of a man who called himself regent while planning, from the very beginning, never to relinquish that title at all. The courtyard had gone utterly silent now. Even the wind seemed to have paused to listen. I am not asking you to simply trust my word, Kellen said. I am asking you to look at the proof yourself, to question the silversmith whose ledger bears his name, to examine the seal on the summons letter he sent, meant to lure me quietly into a trap where his men would ensure I never returned to make this claim at all. He looked directly at Crane now. Because that's what happened at the old hunting lodge. Your soldiers didn't come to escort me home peacefully. They came with silver-tipped bolts, meant specifically to poison Moon Iron, meant to kill me and leave behind a story about a curse finally claiming its due. Crane's face had gone pale. Lies, he managed. But the word came out thinner than before, less certain. There were witnesses, Kellen said. Soldiers who fled when the attempt failed. Men who can be found, questioned, asked, under oath exactly whose orders sent them. The court captain, a broad-shouldered man Ren hadn't noticed until now, stepped forward from the crowd. Older gray at the temples, something careful and searching in his expression as he studied both Kellen and Crane in turn. Your Grace? He addressed Kellen with the careful formality of a man weighing exactly how much risk his next words carried. If what you're saying is true, if there's proof to be examined properly, through the council, through due process there is, Kellen said. And I welcome that examination. Every document, every witness. I have nothing to hide, Captain. Which is more than the Regent can currently claim. The captain turned to Crane. My Lord Regent, do you have an answer to these accusations? For a moment, Crane said nothing at all. Then something in his expression shifted. The careful mask slipping, just slightly, revealing something colder underneath. You'd take the word of a man who vanished for years, Crane said, voice low now, dangerous in a way it hadn't been before, over the word of the man who kept this kingdom stable through his absence. I'd take proof, the captain said evenly, over accusation either way, my lord. It was Ren who noticed it first, the slight shift in Crane's stance. The way his hand had drifted almost casually toward the ornate dagger at his belt, the way his eyes had begun cataloging its the number of guards loyal to him personally versus the number who might, given proof enough, choose differently. He's not going to let this go to council, she said quietly, close to Kellen's ear. Look at him, he's calculating an escape. Sharpened, following her, seeing exactly what she'd seen. Or worse, he murmured back. Crane's hand closed around the dagger's hilt. Enough, he snarled, all pretense dropping away at once. Enough of this farce. Guards seize him, seize them both. For a terrible moment nothing happened. The guards, Ren realized, watching their faces, were hesitating. Caught between years of obedience to Crane and the mounting, undeniable weight of proof suggesting that obedience had been built on a lie, seized them. Crane shouted again, and this time, 3 guards moved, uncertain but obedient, blades half drawn. Kellen stepped forward, placing himself between the advancing guards and Ren, voice carrying with an authority that belonged entirely to a man who had at last stopped asking permission to claim what was his. Stand down, 2 words simple. Absolute. The guards froze because something in his voice Ren realized carried more than sound. Carried the particular weight of royal blood finally speaking with its full authority restored. An authority that had been silenced for years and had lost none of its power in the meantime. One by one, the guards lowered their blades. Crane's face contorted with fury. You have no right. I have every right, Kellen said. I am the rightful king of this kingdom. You are a man who murdered your way to a borrowed throne and called it duty. That ends today. Crane's composure shattered. You think proof and a raised voice are enough? His hand tightened on the dagger. I have spent years building loyalty in this palace. Years ensuring the people who matter understand exactly where their interests lie. You think a handful of old letters undoes that? No, Kellen said quietly. I think the truth does. Loyalty built on fear collapses the moment fear finds something to fear in return. He gestured, and Ren realized, with a jolt, that this had been planned. That somewhere between the hunting lodge and the capital gates, Kellen had arranged for this exact moment. Because Odessa Marsh stepped forward from the gathered crowd, silver hair catching the winter light, carrying a small locked box Ren recognized instantly. I have this kingdom's archives for 30 years, Odessa said, voice carrying clear across the courtyard. I kept records the regent believed destroyed. Records proving exactly what his grace has claimed here today. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, louder now, less uncertain. And I am not the only one, Odessa continued, who has waited years for someone brave enough to finally ask the right questions. More figures stepped forward from the crowd. A woman Ren didn't recognize, dressed in servant's clothes, who spoke of overhearing Crane discuss the binding ritual months before it happened. An older man, once a member of the royal guard, who described being reassigned to a distant post the week after voicing concerns about the ritual's legitimacy. And then, from near the back of the courtyard, a voice Ren hadn't expected to hear at all, Garrett Sorrel. He stepped forward pale, clearly aware of exactly how much this moment might cost him, and spoke anyway. I was at the checkpoint, he said, voice tight but carrying. Crane's men told me directly. Their orders were to kill his grace at the hunting lodge and blame it on the curse. I have the names of every soldier stationed there that week, and I'll give them to this council, under oath, right now, if it means the truth finally outweighs whatever loyalty I once owed the wrong man. Ren stared at him, genuinely stunned. Kellen's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, the way a man's shoulders ease when a piece he wasn't certain of falls finally into place. Piece by piece, witness by witness, the careful architecture of years of lies began, publicly, irreversibly, to collapse. Crane's face had gone the color of old ash. This is a conspiracy, he said, but his voice had lost all its former certainty. All of you coordinated, paid perhaps, by a man desperate to reclaim a throne he abandoned. I didn't abandon it, Kellen said. It was taken from me. And I have spent years in silence, unable to defend myself, while you built a kingdom trust on the exact same lie you're trying to sell right now. The court captain stepped forward again, expression hard now, decision clearly made. My Lord Regent, he said, formal and final. By the weight of this evidence and these witnesses, I am placing you under arrest, pending full council review. Crane's eyes went wide. Then in one desperate motion he pulled the dagger free. I built this kingdom's stability, he shouted, backing toward the palace steps, blade raised, eyes wild with the particular panic of a man watching everything he'd built collapse in real time. I earned this throne through years of careful work while he hid like a coward. You earned nothing, Kellen said, stepping forward despite the blade, voice steady even now. You stole, and theft, however carefully dressed up, is still theft. What happened next happened fast. Crane lunged, not toward Kellen, but toward Ren, some desperate final gambit to use her as leverage, a hostage to bargain his way free of the mounting collapse around him. Ren didn't freeze. Years of learning to read danger before it fully announced itself, years of ducking sharp words and sharper hands in the Halden household, had taught her exactly one thing that mattered in this moment. She stepped sideways instead of back, let his lunge overextend past where she'd been standing. And when his arms swept through empty air where she should have been, she drove her elbow hard into his ribs, exactly as she'd once done, half remembered, half instinctive, defending herself against a drunk stable hand years earlier. Crane staggered. Kellen was already there, disarming him with the same brutal efficiency Ren had watched at the hunting lodge, twisting the dagger free and pinning Crane's arm before he could recover. It's over, Kellen said, voice, low final. This ends today. Crane, pinned and breathing hard, looked up at him with something that might have been hatred, or might have simply been the particular despair of a man watching every carefully constructed lie of his life collapse at once. You'll never rule the way I did, he spat. You're too soft, too trusting. This kingdom needs someone willing to do what's necessary. This kingdom, Kellen said quietly, needs someone willing to tell the truth. That's a bar you never once managed to clear. The guards took Crane into custody. Not gently, but not cruelly either. The particular careful handling of men who understood exactly how thoroughly their loyalty had just been proven misplaced. Ren stood beside Kellen in the courtyard as the crowd began slowly to shift from stunned silence into something else, whispers becoming louder. Louder, becoming something close to cheering. His Grace has returned, the true king, alive, home. Kellen turned to her, breathing hard, something raw and overwhelmed behind his eyes. We did it, he said. You did it, Renton corrected gently. I just handed you paste and elbowed a tyrant. A real laugh escaped him then. The kind of sound that came from somewhere. He probably hadn't expected to find laughter again after so many years of silence. Both of those things, he said, were rather essential to the outcome. The council convened within 2 days. Ren's expected, if she was honest, something closer to a formality. A room full of nobles nodding along to proof already laid bare in the courtyard. A verdict decided before anyone sat down. What she found instead was longer, slower, and far more exacting than she'd imagined. A full week of testimony examined line by line, witness by witness, the particular grinding patience of men who understood that a kingdom rebuilding its trust in the crown could not afford to rebuild it on evidence handled carelessly. On the second day, they questioned the silversmith directly, brought up from the lower quarter under guard, an old man with ink-stained fingers, who confirmed the commission in a voice that shook less from fear, Ren thought, than from the particular relief of finally being allowed to tell the truth about something he'd carried alone for years. I knew the buyer wasn't ordering jewelry, the old man said, eyes on his own hands rather than on Crane, seated pale and rigid at the far end of the chamber. Moon iron bound with a blood charm isn't jewelry. I asked him. His questions in those days had a way of ending careers. Or worse. On the 4th day, they brought Crane himself before the full council, and Ren watched, seated beside Kellen in the gallery reserved for the crown, as a man who had built 5 years of careful command tried, and failed, to talk his way back through a door that had already closed behind him. You claim this binding was tradition, one councilwoman said, an older woman with silver at her temples and a voice that carried the particular weight of someone who had sat on this council long before Crane's regency began. Yet no archive, no precedent, no prior succession in 400 years supports that claim. Explain the discrepancy, my lord. Crane's jaw tightened. Traditions are not always written down. Convenient, the councilwoman said, that the one tradition missing from every written record happens to be the ones that cites the only man who could contradict your account of it. Crane had no answer for that, not a real one. On the 6th day, Garrett testified formally, under oath, naming every soldier stationed at the checkpoint, every payment he'd witnessed change hands, every private conversation he'd overheard in Crane's outer chambers before deciding, at the mountain pass, that continuing to serve the wrong master had finally become a heavier weight than his own comfort was worth carrying. Why come forward now? A councilman asked him, not when silence would have cost you nothing. Garrett was quiet a long moment before answering. Because I watched a woman I spent years dismissing stand her ground against soldiers sent to kill her husband, he said. And I realized watching that I had spent my entire life mistaking cruelty for strength. I'd rather be remembered for telling the truth late than for staying silent forever. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't even entirely honest. Ren suspected, listening from the gallery, some old vanity still threaded through his careful phrasing. But it was, she thought, probably as close to true as Garrett Sorrel had ever come in his life. Crane, held in custody through it all, offered little real defense beyond increasingly desperate accusations that grew, with each passing day, less convincing to a court that had already seen the proof laid plain before them, piece by piece, witness by witness, until even the counselors who had owed their positions to his favor could no longer find a version of events that let him remain innocent. By the end of the week, the verdict was formal and final. Aldrich Crane, stripped of every title he'd claimed, would face judgment for treason, an attempted murder of the crown itself, and Kellen Ashgrove, rightful king, would be formally restored to the throne his father had left him. The coronation was set for 10 days later, which gave Ren, if she was honest, exactly 10 days to fully absorb the strange new shape her life had taken. 10 days to walk through palace halls she'd never imagined seeing, wearing dresses finer than anything she'd owned in her entire life, learning names and titles and the particular careful choreography of court life that felt, someday, more overwhelming than the danger they'd just survived. Odessa Marsh came to the palace on the 3rd day, summoned formally now, restored to her old position as royal archivist with a ceremony far quieter than the one that awaited Kellen, but no less meaningful for its size. Ren found her in the palace library that afternoon, surrounded by towers of records reclaimed from wherever Crane's people had scattered them, sorting with the brisk efficiency of a woman, finally allowed to do properly the work she'd been exiled for doing at all. "You look like a woman with a great deal on her mind," Odessa said, not looking up from the ledger in her hands. "I look like a woman who spent 23 years scrubs floors and sorting herbs, about to be crowned queen of a kingdom she'd never once set foot in before." 2 weeks ago, Ren said. "I'm so certain there's a comfortable way to carry that." Odessa set the ledger down, studied her properly now, the same sharp appraising look she'd given Kellen's Mark that first night in Halstead Crossing. "May I offer you something?" she said, "that nobody bothered offering me. Back when I was young and frightened and certain I didn't belong in the rooms I'd found myself standing in?" Ren nodded. "Belonging isn't something you arrive already carrying," Odessa said. "It's something you build, day by decision, until one morning you look up and realize the room has simply gotten used to you being in it. Nobody is born belonging anywhere. They earn it. Same as you're already earning it whether you can feel it happening yet or not." "How long did it take you," Ren asked, "to feel like you belonged in this palace?" Odessa considered that, something wry and knowing in her expression. 15 years. And then Crane decided I belonged somewhere considerably colder and further away instead. A pause, gentler now. "But that's the thing about belonging once you've genuinely built it. It doesn't disappear just because someone with more power decides to pretend it never existed. I came back. The truth came back with me. That's not luck, that's simply what happens eventually, when something is actually real." Ren carried that with her the rest of the afternoon, turning it over the way she once turned over unfamiliar herbs, testing its shape, decidingly, that she believed it. She found Kellen on the 6th evening, standing alone on a balcony overlooking the city, watching lamplight flicker to life across rooftops that had, years ago, belonged entirely to him. "You look like a man thinking too hard about something," she said, joining him at the railing. He glanced at her, something soft settling into his expression. "I keep waiting to wake up in the cabin, wondering if any of this actually happened." "It happened," Ren said. "I have the bruised elbow to prove it." That earned another laugh, quieter this time but real. "I've been thinking about the coronation," Kellen said after a moment, turning serious again. "About what kind of king I want to be." Crane ruled through fear and careful lies. "I don't want that legacy attached to this crown ever again." "Then don't build one like it," Ren said simply. He looked at her a long moment. "I want you beside me. Not as a formality, not as a political arrangement the council thinks looks proper for a returning king. I want you crowned as my queen because you've earned that place more thoroughly than anyone I've ever known." Ren's breath caught. "Kellen, I mean it," he said, voice steady despite the vulnerability underneath it. "You didn't marry a king that day at Silverpeen. You married a voiceless outcast everyone told you was worthless. You chose me before you knew any of this waited on the other side. That's worth more to me than any crown Crane ever stole." Ren felt her throat tighten. The weight of everything. The chapel, the salt at her feet, the cabin, the poison, the long ride to the capital, pressing gently against her chest all at once. "I didn't marry you for a crown," she said softly. "I married you because you were the first person who ever looked at me and saw something worth choosing." "Then let me choose you back," Kellen said publicly, permanently. "As my queen." Delphine Halden arrived at the palace gates 2 days before the ceremony, unannounced, traveling alone, without her family's usual entourage of guards and gossip. The palace steward nearly turned her away entirely, until, informed of the visitor's name, found herself surprised by her own curiosity outweighing whatever old caution still lingered underneath it. She received her in a small sitting room rather than any formal chamber, deliberately, wanting whatever this oration turned out to be to happen somewhere that didn't advertise the distance now sitting between them. Delphine looked smaller than Ren remembered. Not physically. Something else. The particular smallness of a person who has spent her whole life performing confidence and has finally run out of audience worth performing it for. "I didn't expect you to see me," Delphine said, standing stiffly near the door, as though uncertain she'd actually be allowed to stay. "I almost didn't," Ren admitted. "I'm still deciding whether that was the right choice." Delphine's mouth twisted, something between a wince and a bitter private smile. "That's more honesty than I probably deserve." "Probably," Ren agreed. "Why did you come?" Delphine was quiet a moment, gathering whatever she'd traveled all this way to say. "I wrote you a letter once, after the coronation news reached Silverpine. I don't know if it said what I actually meant, or if I even know what I meant writing it." She twisted her hands together. I grew up being taught that people like you existed, to make people like me look generous by comparison. Taking you in. Feeding you. It was never framed as cruelty. It was framed as charity. I didn't question it because questioning it would have meant admitting I'd spent my whole life benefiting from something ugly. And now? Now I've watched you survive things that would have broken people raised with every advantage I had, Delphine said. I've watched Garrett choose honesty over comfort, for possibly the first time in his life, because you and Kellen proved something was worth more than his own safety. And I find myself for the first time genuinely uncertain whether I was ever the person I believed myself to be. Ren studied her a long moment, weighing the particular exhaustion of forgiveness against the particular exhaustion of carrying old resentment forward into a life that no longer had room for it. I'm not going to tell you it's forgiven, she said finally. That would be a lie, and I've had enough lies dressed up as kindness to several lifetimes. But I will tell you this. I don't need you to suffer for me to move forward. I just needed you to finally see clearly. It sounds like you're starting to? Delphine's eyes glistened, though she blinked it back quickly. Old habits of composure dying hard even now. That's more grace than I expected. It's not grace, Ren said. It's simply that I'd rather spend my energy building something new than guarding something old. You're welcome to attend the coronation if you'd like. Or you're welcome to go home. Either way, I wish you well. Genuinely. That's the strangest part of all this, I find I actually mean it. Delphine left without a formal goodbye, only the particular gesture of someone recalibrating an entire worldview in real time, and not yet certain what would replace it. Ren watched her go from the sitting room window, feeling something settle inside her chest that wasn't quite peace, not entirely but was perhaps the beginning of something close enough to count. On the morning of the coronation, Kellen stood alone in the small antechamber adjoining the great hall, listening to the muffled sound of the gathering court beyond the heavy doors, and found himself, for one unguarded moment, exactly as uncertain as the boy he'd been the day his father died. He thought of that day now. 23 years old, standing in this very palace, being told by a man he'd trusted his entire life that a crown needed protecting from its own heir until that heir proved himself ready. He'd believed it because believing it had been easier than questioning a man who'd carried him on his shoulders as a child. He understood now, with the particular clarity that only comes from having survived the alternative, exactly how dangerous easy belief could be. When handed carelessly to the wrong person, he would not make that mistake again. Not with this crown. Not with this kingdom. Not with anyone who ever stood close enough to be trusted with either. A soft knock interrupted the thought. Ren, already dressed for the ceremony, stepped into the antechamber, closing the door quietly behind her. You look like a man rehearsing an argument with someone who isn't in the room, she said. Just an old one, Kellen said. With myself, mostly. About whether I've actually learned anything from the last 5 years, or whether I'm simply hoping I have. Ren crossed to him, straightened the collar of his formal coat with careful, practiced fingers, the same steady care she'd once used to bind a poisoned wound in an abandoned lodge with nothing but wolfsbane and desperate hope. For what it's worth, she said. I've watched you make careful decisions every single day since that morning at the chapel. You listened when I disagreed with you. You waited when I asked you to wait. You trusted witnesses over your own certainty, when certainty would have been so much easier to lean on. That's not a man repeating old mistakes. That's a man who's actually learned something from them. Kellen caught her hand, held it against his chest a long moment, feeling something settle in him that hadn't fully settled in 5 long years of silence and doubt. I don't know how to thank you, he said quietly, for helping me become someone worth trusting with any of this. You don't need to thank me, Ren said. Just keep being him. That's payment enough. Beyond the door, a herald's voice, calling the court to order, calling the ceremony to begin. Kellen took a slow breath, steadied himself one final time and offered Ren his arm. Ready? Together, she said, echoing the word that had carried them across half a kingdom and back again. Always together. From here the coronation itself unfolded, beneath a sky scrubbed clean of clouds. Winter sun catching gold thread woven through royal banners hung along every wall of the great hall. Ren stood beside Kellen at the base of the throne, wearing a gown of deep blue silk, the crowned wolf embroidered across the bodice in silver thread that caught the light with every small movement. Elder Corwin, traveled all the way from Silverpine at Kellen's specific request, performed the ceremony with hands considerably steadier than they'd been the day he'd bound 2 strangers together beneath black salt and mocking laughter. By right of blood, Corwin intoned, voice carrying through the hushed hall. and by proof laid bare before this court, I crown Kellen Ashgrove, true king of this realm. The crown settled onto Kellen's head. Simple, ancient, heavier than it looked. He turned to Ren. By choice, Corwin continued, voice softening slightly, made not once but twice, in a chapel that mocked her and in a kingdom that didn't yet know her name, I crown Ren Ashgrove, queen of this realm. The smaller crown, silver instead of gold, settled onto Ren's head. For a moment the entire hall held its breath. Then Kellen reached for her hand, in front of the full court, in front of nobles who had once, under Crane's rule, learned to value silence and obedience above honesty, and spoke words that carried clear and unwavering across the hall. I lost my voice to a lie. I found it again because a woman refused to let fear decide who deserved kindness. Let this kingdom remember that lesson going forward, more than it remembers any crown. The applause that followed was not the careful, performed applause of a court trained under Crane. It was real. Afterward, once the formal ceremony had given way to the quieter business of a court slowly learning how to celebrate honestly again, Ren found a moment alone near one of the tall windows lining the great hall, watching snow fall soft and unhurried over the city beyond the glass. Kellen found her there, crown still faintly unfamiliar on his brow, and joined her at the window without a word. The particular comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed constant speech to understand each other. Second thoughts, he asked eventually. Now that it's actually happened? None, Ren said. Though I confess I keep waiting for someone to throw black salt at my feet again, just to remind me this is real and not some elaborate dream I'm about to wake from. Kellen laughed softly. The sound still faintly new even to his own ears. Still something he seemed to reach for carefully, gratefully, like a man handling a gift he hadn't quite believed he'd be allowed to keep. No salt, he said. Not tonight, not ever again if I have any say in how this kingdom treats the people it once decided weren't worth protecting. Ren leaned against him, watching the snow continue its patient descent over rooftops that now belonged, in some strange and still settling way, to both of them equally. Thank you, she said quietly, for waiting in that doorway. For offering a choice instead of taking one. For every quiet,
patient thing you did in the weeks since that made me believe slowly
that I was actually allowed to want something better for myself. Kellen pressed a kiss to her temple, gentle and unhurried, a king who had learned, the hardest way possible, exactly how much a single quiet gesture could mean to someone who had spent her whole life being denied them. Thank you, he said softly, for choosing to stay, even when everything in that chapel told you it would be easier to walk away. Outside the snow kept falling, soft and covering the city in a clean, unbroken white that asked nothing of anyone and forgave everything it touched, and wrapped in firelight and crown, and the particular quiet certainty of two people who had chosen each other freely, long before either of them understood what that choice would eventually cost or what, in the end, it would give back tenfold. Ren allowed herself finally to simply exist inside the good thing she had built, without waiting for it to be taken away. Ren stood in the center of it, the weight of the silver crown settling against her hair, and thought, briefly, of a girl who had once stood at a different altar with wine dripping down her borrowed dress, certain that nothing good could ever come, looking for someone the world had already decided to throw away. That girl had been wrong, gloriously permanently wrong. Kellen's fingers tightened gently around hers, steady, certain, the same quiet patience he'd offered her that first cold morning at Silverpeen, when he'd waited in a chapel doorway with nothing but a wooden sign and a folded piece of paper that promised her the one thing nobody else ever had. A choice she had made it then, in a room full of people who mocked her. She made it again now, in a hall full of people who had learned, finally, to see her clearly. And this time, there was no black salt scattered at her feet, only the quiet, settled certainty of two people who had chosen each other freely, before either of them understood what that choice would cost, or what it would eventually give back. Worth, Ren thought, standing there beneath the weight of a crown she had never once asked for, was never about the volume of the room around you. It was about who stayed close enough to hear you when the room finally went quiet. Somewhere behind them, the great hall's music began again, warm and unhurried, and the court that had once learned to mistake fear for order, slowly filled the floor with something closer to genuine celebration than any of them had known how to offer in years. Ren watched it happen, still faintly disbelieving, still turning the shape of her own new life over in her hands like an unfamiliar stone she hadn't yet decided how to hold. Kellen's hand found hers again, steady, certain, unwilling to let the moment pass without marking it properly. Ready for the rest of it? He asked. voice low beneath the swelling music. Whatever comes next. Ren looked at him. At the crown settled easy now against his dark hair. At the scar along his jaw that would never fully fade. At the quiet, patient man who had once stood silent in a chapel doorway, offering nothing but a choice and had somehow, in the weeks since, offered her an entire life she hadn't known how to want until he'd shown her, patiently, exactly what wanting it might look like. Together, she said, the words settling comfortable and certain between them now, worn smooth from use, carrying none of the uncertainty it had once held on a cold road leading away from Silverpeen, and everything they'd both left behind there. Together, Kellen agreed, and led her, at last, into whatever came next.